Good morning, everybody. Today's date is Friday, June 5th, 2020, and you are listening to episode number 78 of CV Central. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. I want to thank you for joining us this morning and say it's good to be back. You guys will be hearing me live on iTunes. Well, not live, technically recorded, but the same day. iTunes, Google Play, Podbean, and other various fine podcasters I don't know about. So the computer is fixed. I want to say a great thank you to the audience for helping make that possible. It's running better than ever, and we've got it in good shape so the story can continue. And if you want to read some of the background research, we recommend you join the Telegram group at t.me/Coronavirus Central, and you can always send information, notes, commentary to me at coronaviruscentral@pm.me. So I read everything and I try to comment when I have time. Days are busy these days, but I do try to get back to everyone, whether you agree or disagree, and that's part of the story. And of course, I can be found easily at Twitter at coronaviruscast. So here we are, Friday, June 5th, and since, for those of you who are starting to listen to me live on, the podcast platform rather than YouTube, you probably have seen the world has fallen apart more or less in the last 2 weeks, which isn't altogether surprising given the trajectory we were on, although the proximal reasons why it happened were certainly not ones we could predict, and isn't that the way of life, right? That things happen when you're busy looking for other problems. But the fact of having cascading problems continue is not altogether surprising, although the virulence and vehemence with which these protests have evolved into something larger is a big story, and it's not an entirely natural phenomenon either, although it is certainly driven by some very real instincts and impulses, which is what you need. I mean, what you do is you take, if you want a big fire, right, you need a lot of fuel to be there, and the fuel is the anger and uncertainty people have about their position in American life, but ultimately some people have to be the fire starters, and there's a lot of money coming in there to ensure a constant fuel and match going forward. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about where America's going, and we'll talk about all of those problems. But before we talk about that, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about how this show will evolve. So we have not gotten past the threat of the coronavirus. We've looked past it, which is not surprising. And at this point, the threats in front of us are so imminent that we must, for our own safety, welfare, and frankly sanity, talk about those and focus on those while we manage to keep in the back of our mind and through our behaviors an awareness that a virus is lurking that can do a lot of damage both chronically and immediately, that can recur at any time, that we think is artificial in nature and therefore may be re-released or redeveloped. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. And I'm going to emphasize the Monday shows really to keep the eye on that. I'm going to put one eye on that, and I'm going to put two eyes to be the crazy three-eyed fool on Wednesdays and Friday shows looking at the larger unrest happening. Not the least of which because a lot of times over the weekend we're going to see things go really badly, and I don't want to always be reporting on that, although I reserve the right to flip around how I do these things. So as we go into this show is going to evolve, and it's we are a community and a collaboration, and I'm proud of that. And I'm utterly disgusted with the fact that we are being maneuvered into a series of events that are going to set us all against one another. And I know as sure as anything it's going to happen because I feel it happening to myself. I know because certain people make certain arguments certain ways and they believe certain things that we end up in certain fights, and people who could work together and who are actually very polite and decent to one another are going to really struggle to do so now because we come into this with pre-arranged, pre-propagandized beliefs. So I'm going to tell my story a little bit here at the beginning, and I'm looking, as I do this, for feedback from you about where to go from here, because I'll be honest, I've literally sat and I've thought about closing up shop on this, because I don't know if you guys want me to tell you the story of what is happening now in an America that is under threat of revolution, for better or worse, by the way. I know people have different opinions on the value of that. And it's not a story I can tell you the way I told you the coronavirus story. I can't sit here and tell you with nice and antiseptic virus is and tell it in a neutral, dispassionate way. I can't tell you in a way that's not going to offend your sensibilities and run straight into ideological things you believe to be core bedrock truths and just eviscerate some of them. On all sides, by the way. I'm not trying to be a partisan so much as I'm trying to share with you realpolitik. And realpolitik, basically, what it does is it looks at the facts, the reality, and the hard assessment of a situation, cuts through all the bullshit that people put out there as fluff and rhetoric, and it offers a real hard look at what is happening out there and what the consequences of things are. And such analysis requires you to look at things as the way they are and not the way you'd wish they'd be. And American political discourse in general likes to look at things as being true. For instance, we have our cultural truths. All men are created equal. That's a lie. No two men are created equal because no two men are the same. We're all different, and we are different by group, by race, by gender, by all these things. And it doesn't mean we can't work together, and it doesn't mean that everyone should be stereotyped or categorized. It doesn't mean that at all. It means exactly the opposite. But it does mean that there are legitimate interests and there are competing interests. And as we go through this, one of the things that I can do is I can analyze this where you see that there are collaborative strategies and competitive strategies. And the idea that we can all have a mass cooperation of everyone is a great idea. Don't misunderstand me. I would love to see it happen, but we are dealing with a series of events deliberately designed, in my opinion, to go ahead and make that impossible. And I know that because of the angry grams I get. And it's pretty funny. Whenever I talk about certain issues of social justice, I get two types of emails. I get angry white women over the age of 35 sending me emails about how they can't talk to me anymore because I've offended them, which, that's fine. If you can't stand listening to it, you're not listening to the right show, and I'm okay with that. I know I'm going to lose people, and I accept that. Conversely, I get emails from a lot of people within the minority community who say, hey, Tom, can you help us out? You're dead on about the problems. And that's what I do, and I do help them out because that's what I want to do. My job is to help the people who listen to this show survive, to be aware of the challenges around them, and to escape the manipulations being done to them. And in doing so, begin crafting an alternative to the war we are being set up to fight between countries and within this country. And I don't know if we're going to escape it, to be honest with you. I don't even know if I can escape it. I mean, I sit here and honesty compels me to share with you that as this thing gets worse and worse, as much as I've been playing observer to this point, I may in fact go back to doing some activism. I may go back to being an active participant in nasty, nasty politics, because from the way I look at it, I have interest, I have ideas, I have things that I have to defend, and if things go certain directions or certain actions aren't taken, I'm going to be out there because I realize that if you deal with a threat early while you still have the ability to organize and fight it, you can do a lot more good than if you wait till later. And I've never pretended to be a passive observer or participant in life. I am a difficult, polarizing figure who is incredibly smart and very passionate in certain ways, but incredibly analytical and cold in others. And I serve a certain purpose in this system where for years, I've been a commentator on things that people all talk about in quiet and pretend about in public. And so I have an interesting audience that's followed me over the years of people who are incredibly aware and highly placed or incredibly ideological. And I know it's not for everybody. And Coronavirus Central was a show designed to keep everyone safe. And that was the story I had to tell, and I did the very best I could. And I will continue talking to that, by the way. This has not gone away, but it's one part of a larger story now. And as a historian, I understand the story has to be told in its full depth. And so I'm going to go forward, and I will consider telling you the story as I see it, which will not sound like what anyone else is telling you, most likely. It will be upsetting, it will be angering, it will be frustrating, it will challenge your views, and I'm sure you will challenge mine, and I'll be honest, I don't particularly enjoy it, but I mean, if I'm going to tell it, I have the obligation to listen and be fair about that, and I will, because I do understand there's complexity, and that one of the things that's going to happen a lot in this is people with good intentions are going to find themselves having to defend positions that are difficult in defense of things they genuinely support with people whose heart is often in the right place. And I say that with immense respect because my core belief is that most people trying to act at this point are trying to do so in a good way. people on the left who are out supporting these protests want to see change to systemic problems of inequality. And I respect that, and I think people have the right, individually and collectively, to be treated with dignity and respect in a way that's fair and equitable. I don't doubt that. However, the reality is that a few people will have a disproportionate influence, and the tail wags the dog as ever, where, what happens is the story gets determined by a few actors who take advantage of the actions of the whole. And on the right, it will be the same thing, and we're going to be living in a time of inevitably an escalating violence, political unrest, deceit, deprivation, and despair. And this is a nasty story. And I am not impartial in it. I am certainly not fully neutral. I will try to tell sides honestly, but I'm not going to pretend that I don't lean a certain way, because I can't. I mean, I could, but it would be insincere, and frankly, I have neither the desire nor the energy to do that. And so what I look for is a way out of this mess, a third way out of the system. And radical centrism, which is kind of what I actually believe, and what it basically means is that rather than looking at things ideologically, I operate in a nationalist perspective based in protecting and saving people who want to work together, with an understanding that the state and market are just tools that can be used. And I think ideology is a psychological trick. It's a shortcut people develop so that they can understand things they don't want to understand in depth, issue by issue, and they use a general set of principles to guide them. And that's okay. I mean, general sets of principles, we all do this all the time, not just with politics. But we do that, and what happens is sometimes we get it really wrong. It's like I was joking to one of my friends. I think the left has some absolutely great ideas, but conversely, I think they have absolutely atrocious ones as well, and they can't tell the difference between them. And on the other hand, I was telling them the same breath that the right has the right idea to be responsible about everything, but sometimes they go ahead and they defend things that really are indefensible. And the challenge, I guess I would throw out to all of us, and I say us because Lord knows that I've spent a lot of time thinking and praying these last few days. I'm like, can I even tell this story? And forgive me for indulging my Christian beliefs for just 1 second, but, Jesus was a peacemaker. And over these last few days, I've tried to engage people and play peacemaker in honor of what I'm supposed to follow in my own beliefs. And I gotta tell you, it's made me hate people more. I mean, there are people who I kind of like, and I talk to them, and they say things to me that are just so patently absurd that I'm like, the only way I can even deal with these people is to not even be connected to them anymore. And I'm considering that. I'll be blunt with you. I'm considering going back to my hermit lifestyle, writing books, and enjoying not having to get up in the morning and to tell these heartbreaking stories for you. But I've had so many of you write me and say, Tom, tell us the story. You're the only one who's out there telling us what's really happening. And there's a high price that we all pay for that. And I want to be clear about that too, that I have had a lot of people over the years attacked who were friends with me for guilt through association. And if I start telling this story the way I think it needs to be told, you may be in risk of that. And I certainly am here to help you, and I'm not here to try to make things worse. I never do that, although sometimes it happens that way, because that's the problem of zero-sum games. So, sort of a long and wandering monologue this morning, but I'm saying it because next week I'm going to cover what we got going on with the virus, with trade, with unrest, all the things that are going to come out, whether it goes to coup, martial law. There's a lot of things on the table, and I'm going to go at least one more week. But you guys have to tell me, do you want me to go forward? Do you want me to tell the story? And give me your feedback, yes or no. I mean, it's fine. And I'll go where the preponderance goes, with the understanding that this is going to be an evolving show. And as such, I just have to tell you what I believe to be true. And like anything else, it's not necessarily that me believing something to be true makes it true. But I find that the way I tell things and the way I think I've been told over the years is different from the way other people see things. And perhaps there's value in it. And if there's value in it that keeps your family safe and makes you aware of the things that are out there, that is a story that is very much worth telling, I think, and that I can manage to find a few times a week to go out there and tell that story, because I'm committed to my community. And, the show will probably get rebranded at that point, and we'll continue forward, and we'll tell the story, and the story will have to be the thing. So, that's how I'm looking at this right now, and that is where we go forward from here. So if you're listening and I say something that offends you, I'm not saying it to offend you, and I'm not saying it to hurt your feelings or to judge against you. My goal is to try to find equitable solutions for all people, including ones who are at dispute. And that is America, right? The whole thing's falling apart. And for our international audience, I hope maybe my commentary will give you a glimpse into how and why the hyperpower is falling apart. And I will also be honest with you, as a preface to this, I don't think we're going to get out of this clean. I think we're going to end up in a fight. I think a civil war is very likely. I was a cultural commentator who wrote about that. I've written several books on the topic, and I've been involved with heavy-duty radical political activism for years. The reason I understand certain things is because I've lived them. And I think it's going to become more that direction. And, I could go out like the mainstream media and frankly blow smoke up your ass and tell you that everything's going to be okay and these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. But I will tell you, when you paint a story between a hero and a villain, all right, whichever way you see it, you make conflict inevitable. That's what game theory would teach you. It's called a zero-sum game. When you have two people playing tug of war and that's the game, only one side can ever win. Except for maybe the people who are robbing the bank while you're busy playing tug of war, and that's a whole other story. But we find ourselves over and over again, as I was sharing on Twitter, find ourselves where the middle fights the bottom while the wealthy kind of look at this and laugh. I was saying 400 families own 50% of the wealth, and yet we are fighting each other over who has power on these vague abstract terms. Police who are making $70,000 in a pension, abstract concepts of whiteness that basically judge a whole race with stereotypes. I mean, do you think these are going to be successful ways of doing it? Or saying that these whole groups are beyond salvation? I mean, look, I'll be very blunt about this too. Within the right, there is, of course, a stream of thought that says certain people cannot be redeemed. And as a Christian, I don't believe that. And the fact that people don't say things publicly doesn't make the ideas any more present or less present. And so we should be in front of it. And that's why I talk about race. It's why I have for years. Because you can't have something you don't want to talk about that's a big part of the story and tell the story honestly. It would be like telling writing a paragraph without having any conjunctions, without having adjectives. You would just have this bland story that doesn't tell any of the color of it, and that's what you need to be able to do. And so today's episode is going to go to that point. And what I'm going to do today with the stories I've selected is I want you to see the divergent and competing narratives. I want you to see the struggle that promises. I want you to also understand the consequences that are going to occur. And I want you to see that this is part of probably a planned demolition of the United States of America for some as yet unknown cause. But I would suggest it's because the idea of having centralized global authority appeals to a lot of people. And in order for my story to make sense, I'm going to have to give you a lengthy history lesson, which I don't have the time to cite properly, so I will tell the story in brief, and you can choose to believe it or not believe it before we get into the stuff that's been sanitized. I do want you to understand something. As we go into this realm, when we were dealing with the virus, we did very source-driven research. And I know a lot of people like that about this show, and I try to put articles in there where you can trace back the steps. But in order for me to tell the narrative right, I don't have the time to basically create a book to explain every point I have out there. I have a whole library if you want to go buy a couple, and they might help you out, although they'll piss you off to hell if you're a leftist. Just the way it is. I write for a right-leaning audience. The left tried to cancel me many, many years ago, and I've somehow managed to linger. But I want you to understand some historical background that is not commonly taught, not commonly understood, and that will be controversial to some of you. And it really is a story about power and control and the way the world works. And I'm going to tell the story as I believe it to be true. You don't have to necessarily agree with it, but if you understand my beliefs coming into it, I think the framing I put into it will make more sense. So we're going to go back to the 1700s, which seems like a very long time to go back, but remember, I'm a historian and you need to know the foundations of things. And we'll tell a story of two revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And I think it's very relevant because in a lot of ways, what will eventually end up being said will sound like both of these revolutions, where the American Revolution was, at least nominally, although I know it was far more complicated than that, was a defense of property rights in support of liberty, where people in the country basically rose up against people in the city to go ahead and live in a way where they had certain property protections and certain rights returned to them that were taken from a tyrannical leader above, which is how George III was perceived. And one thing not told often about that story, but that Benjamin Franklin himself commented upon, was that the reason why the colonies revolted as much as anything was that the colonies used to have their own cheap money, colonial script. After events happened in the French and Indian War, 1763, what ended up happening was Britain needed to pay for it, and they wanted the colonists to pay for their defense, so they obliged them to use the British pound sterling. And that made the people of America much poorer because they couldn't create their own money, and they were forced to use money worth a lot when they didn't make a lot in order to buy certain goods at the risk of force. And what it did was it impoverished the nation. If you will remember from, and you can look this up, this is a matter of fact, the purchasing power of a dollar since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 now has the purchasing power of less than a penny compared to what a dollar would buy you in 1913. And if you wanted simple proof of this, anecdotally, it's real easy to look at it. Look at the cost of buying goods and services in a drugstore in 1915. Where this costed a nickel or this costed 25 cents, and how much price inflation has risen. Part of that is other goods and services, but let's be honest, we have cheaper transportation, more ability to get things from point to point, and what ended up happening, goods get more expensive all the time. We have factored that in as a natural progression in life. It is not. It is the activation of inflation happening currently in a reserve fiat money system. And we did not start as fiat money, to be very clear, but the idea that you centralize a bank and you create a much more currency, you try to artificially stimulate an economy through the growth of money, like sunlight to a plant. And you have certain problems, but if you don't let a plant ever rest and you don't have cycles, you end up with a giant bubble. That's where we are right now. That's the story of the American Revolution in a small way. It's a story we like to tell where we look very heroic. But the truth is the American Revolution succeeded because the French and Spanish put a lot of money into it. Half the English upper class thought it was a terrible idea to oppress the colonists. And ultimately there were some brave men out there who fought for it. But that this was something that was more of a coup than it was a radical revolution, because you didn't have people going out there, by and large, trying to radically destroy society. Let's fast forward, where we go in 1789, 13 years, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is the revolution, and I will say the American Revolution is what a right-wing revolution kind of looks like. It's more like a civil war where you try to sustain what's happening in society. The French Revolution is the one that scared the crap out of history. And so what happened was that France had three estates that ran their country, and they had run it for many, many years. There was the nobility, which was the first estate. There was the clergy, which was the second estate, which in France was highly Catholic. And there was the third estate, which was the merchants and the shopkeepers and the people who were at the bottom. And what ended up happening was a series of crises, economic problems, food shortages came into place. And eventually there was a citizens' popular uprising. And what ended up happening, that's why Bastille Day celebrated. It was July 14th, 1789, if memory serves. And what ended up happening was a bunch of French prisoners against the crown were released, and they started rioting, and they rioted, and they rioted, and eventually there were guillotines in the streets, and they ended up killing anyone who offended them. It was one of the, probably the worst bloodletting, if within a state, to its own people in history, maybe to that point in time. There had been many examples before that of states going forward and killing other states. And there's certainly been plenty of kings who had done things to sack certain towns that revolted and all that. But a popular revolt by the people that was going ahead and just killing people left and right. I mean, the Committee of Public Safety and Maximilien Robespierre what they did was just everything they looked for. They changed the calendar. I mean, and this will sound familiar to you, that they talked about the injustices. They named all the calendars after flowers and started out saying, hey, we want a peaceful transition. We wanted to have a constitutional monarchy. And within a year, you had a dictatorial leader, the Directorate of Public Safety, I think it was the formal name. And they went ahead and they were just killing anyone who ran afoul of them, making new rules all the time about how things would be and how things wouldn't be. And there was mob justice. And this was a spasm that just wrecked Europe for years, including France. And it was only 10 years later, when Napoleon finally came to ascension in 1799, that the thing had settled down and that those energies, which had actually destroyed a lot of harmful goods or harmful relationships in their society, were reconnected, and a force was unleashed which actually conquered much of Europe. We'll leave the Napoleonic Wars aside. But what you need to understand, and we're talking about the Revolution here, not Napoleon, which was sort of a restoration of sanity to French life in a lot of ways, is that there was this moment where the anger of the people was so riled up that the mob became a force unto itself. And what happened was that changed history, because ultimately those ideas you hear today are the ideas you basically hear in the streets today. You know, the Jacobin movement. And a lot of the people who are actually very intellectually aware and who are the leadership of the hard left are very familiar with Jacobin, the use of terror. And there's a lot of comments about the political uses of violence to compel people to act that are very commonly written. And you don't believe me? I mean, you can go find them. They put them out there publicly. Maoist thought, Stalinist thought. There's a lot of left-wing thoughts about the execution of violence, which isn't to say the left is the only people capable of using violence. Of course, that's not the case. But they see it as a more acceptable political tool when you look at the leadership, not the individuals who run the thing. And so I tell this story because the one thing, the American Revolution didn't scare the elites, really. I mean, fundamentally, they were able to work with America, and that was fine. And that's why America's still here. Every crowned head in Europe went ahead and they tried to crush the French Revolution. And why did they do so? Because they feared for their own safety. And one of the things that has happened, and it's really the story of the history of 19th century Europe, is a fight between imperialism to bring money from without to within, and this social current to try to destroy the leadership class. And what it manifested as was revolutions in 1830, 1848, and that there was this tension that existed throughout Europe that really shaped our modern world, where you had people at the top, on the one hand, who remained terrified of external threats. They were nationalists. They were all still... There wasn't a global overclass at this point. So if you were the king of France or the king of Prussia or one of these countries, you would have to mobilize and nationalize and go ahead and give more power to the people than had ever been done before. But at the same time, you were terrified of that because every now and then, and it's happened in Paris more than anywhere else really, but not just there, you had a lot of revolutions. And one of the revolutions, was 1830 was a good foreteller of 1848. And these two revolutions that happened, where there were cities and communes and things set up, were ultimately put down by an alliance that is called the Holy Alliance of people who wanted to work to keep the old stability order of Europe, and it was Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And I tell this story because those three countries would later be saved to punish. If you know the history of the 20th century, you know that Germany was basically undercut at the end of World War I, and the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. You know that the Tsar's family was brutally murdered, and the Bolsheviks took over in Russia. And you know Austria was divided and shorn of its empire after World War I, where what you saw was the Republican, let's be honest, the sort of left-leaning leadership that ended up taking over the Allied powers, destroyed all the old imperial powers. And what happened is that the old elites were pushed aside. And who did this? Well, it was really the role of money that played it. And if you know the history of that, it goes back, a lot of these things go back to the Napoleonic Wars. You have to look at the history of the Rothschild family and how they came to preeminence with the alliance with the English crown, which was always sort of a nation of shopkeepers, after Napoleon lost at Waterloo, in the way that Rothschild shorted the market and he got control of everything. And as he would say later, I care not who makes the country's laws as long as I control its currency. And that's what ended up happening, and now we live in a world run by bankers because they made a bet and they won the market while people were trying to win the thing on the ground. And controlling the market is like controlling the air supply. You might not be the one who's putting all the knobs and gadgets on there. But if you can control the air supply, you can do a lot, and that's why the banks got control. And the history of America is no different than that. That's why Andrew Jackson had put on his gravestone, "I killed the bank," and that's why Abraham Lincoln may have been assassinated, because he actually went out there and he issued free greenbacks. And whether you like or dislike Lincoln, he did try to keep America apart from the global system that was being forced upon us, which I think has some virtue, and I think a lot of people who really come to understand this come with a renewed respect for the Union beyond the sort of facile they were against slavery. Well, no, they weren't. The Gettysburg Address happened years into the war, and in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, the slave states that stayed in the Union, they were never forced to eliminate their slaves until after the war. When it was decided to do that. So the story you're told is not even close to correct. And I have a lot of people who write me on Twitter telling me, "Tom, you don't know the history. This is what really happened." And believe me, Tom knows the history. I'm the one with the honors degree from Swarthmore. I've studied the history, and I've gotten hated by my school because I've actually studied the history. I went back and read what they said and what they did. And what you find is it's not a story of classes and justice. That's not history. That's a bullshit narrative made to propagandize people for the current moment. What it is it's a story of people in control trying to stay in power who are unhappy about having to give power over to others. And I go back to the French Revolution in this point because after World War II, which was the apotheosis of nationalism, where imperialist nationalist regimes fought really hard to destroy each other on an ideological basis, the people sat around the table, the US, USSR, and everyone who got dragged along with that, and capitalism and communism recognized that they're both secularist, materialist systems. They work towards a sort of fusion in a lot of ways, and the people who were elites on a transnational level said, at that point, we're not going to do this again. And that's when globalism was born, at Bretton Woods. The banks served as the guarantors. The elites decided we're not going to have fights against, countries that matter, and I don't mean that to insult things, but fundamentally, we fight wars where we have, we're swatting flies. The United States doesn't declare war on China or Russia. You fight Iraq, or Russia went into Afghanistan, or China went into Tibet, or France goes into Mali. Countries that are of a certain rank don't attack countries on the other rank, because in World War II, we almost all killed each other, and the elites hated how much power across countries they were giving to their own lower classes, and they weren't happy about it. So they went ahead and they changed things up so that now we would have a system where the people would essentially be brought to a lower level. You'd have mass education that made people less smart. You'd have food that was less nutritious. You would have globalist structures that would bring everyone down to a certain common bottom, and you would allow the rhetoric of equality to flourish, this idea we'd all be brought up to a certain point, but that you would actually have a bifurcation, where there'd be very rich people who you can't access, and you'd have a bunch of other people fighting over the scraps, and ultimately you wanted to disempower your own poor and middle classes, because they understood in history what ended up happening a lot of times is the middle class would get wealth, and they would use wealth to purchase status, and by purchasing status they could get access to the top of the system. And the families who were at the top of the system across countries realized, why do we want to do that? And just like you saw in Orwell's 1984, if you read that, where the top levels of the party stayed separate, they created a system in globalism that was redundant in a way where it was not affected by the people. So whether it's the communist variant in China, right, where the party doesn't care what the people think, or the authoritarian variant in Europe, where they go around and they ultimately have bureaucrats in Brussels who run everything that ignore what the people want, and they make them vote until they get what they want. Or if it's even here in America, where we have people who vote and we're allowed to fight to the death over certain things as a warrior shock troop culture, we ultimately don't get any change. Whether you vote for Obama or Trump, whether you vote for Bush or Clinton, you end up with the same damn policies, and this is the elite that runs it, because even if the politicians want to change things, they can't. And let's be honest, these people are selected. They're $1 trillion campaigns, these elections, to give you two choices that don't make much of a difference. And it's sad that that's the case, but this is the reality we live in. And so we now come to a moment where direct action is contemplated again, but you'll note as we go through this story that one side is suppressed and one side isn't. And so why is the radical left allowed to go out there and burn their own cities to the ground? Because it serves the purpose of the elite that wants to see that people at the bottom get into worse spots in life. And that's ultimately what's doing. I mean, if you think about it, if you believe, and I believe many of our audience does, that you want better wealth and equality for the black populations in the United States and other countries, how does burning their cities down, having all these fights, accomplish anything? It's an expression of infantile rage that will permit the suppression of other things, and all this money being thrown to continue it is designed to destroy what wealth exists that could be used and harnessed against that elite. Because in earlier revolutions, where revolutionaries were a little bit smarter by average, they didn't wreck their own stuff. Rather, they put it together in ways where they would offer real resistance, and they claimed it as their own. And now what we are seeing is the effort to deliberately put chaos in there. And to me, especially when you consider some of the contributions, like the Bank of America dumping millions and millions into these movements, you basically have the elites paying poor people to go on an orgy of destruction, destroying what they want, in defense of an ideology that makes zero sense to accomplish the goals that are out there. Now, there are some very hard people on the radical fringes who say, hey, we have to destroy what's here so we can take them down with us. I understand that logic. It's not entirely crazy. But with respect to the global system, what do you see? You see the United States specifically being wrecked in an orgy of violence, that you see other countries being left out of it. And we've talked for a while about the asymmetrical war. We've talked about China. We've talked about, I've said a couple times, I think Germany's detaching themselves from the West, and Merkel wouldn't come to a G7 meeting, right? So what you see is global internationalism, big finance, going ahead and making it where they're encouraging America to wreck itself. And why? Because there's something in America they don't like. And what is that combination of things? I think the Bill of Rights is part of it. I think they dislike liberty. I think it's the fact that we have been off the reservation a little bit, being nationalist and thinking that we're above the system. I think that's part of it. And I think it's been an opportunity to redraw the lines that allow them to do so in a way they like much more. So if you look at this, whether you lean left or right, you have to understand, in the bigger scheme of things, America is being set up for deliberate destruction. And I think that's no accident, and that's a big part of the story. And any of us who go into this, whether it be the virus destroying our economy, whether it be the result in ideological / race war that's being threatened between the city and the country on one hand. And I want to be very clear, this isn't about me saying who's good and who's bad. I believe that most people are sincere in their inclinations and that they're trying to accomplish something positive through their actions. Obviously, there are baiters on all sides. I admit that. There are rioters who are out there who are just getting free stuff. And there's a lot of people, to be blunt, who are out there getting paid to do so and move around. And that part of it is really telling, that this is not a popular revolution against the elite. This is the elites co-opting a movement. And I've seen it before. I saw the same thing with the Tea Party on the right wing, where it started out as being something, hey, we want to go back to simple government. And then the Koch brothers came in and they dumped money and prestige on the leaders of this movement, said, we're going to work together. Let's just get us open borders first because, hey, you're for open borders, right? You believe in freedom. And they hijack movements. And elites are very good at this because they have unlimited money. Ultimately, banks can go back and do this. And if you understand it, you really study it, you begin to understand that the Federal Reserve controls how the money goes, and the owners of that border, the owners of the world, and the CIA is their enforcement agency. And so the permanent bureaucracy in Washington, which is what they care about, not the White House, that's just a little bit of melodrama we usually get because no president, including this one, has had the balls to do what's necessary to actually fight that system, for various reasons, some of which are better than others, end up putting us in a position where we are now maneuvered into fights against one another with no hope or help from above. And so we have each other, and this is open source intelligence. This is the real world you live in. It's not a pretty story. It's not a nice, neat tie and bow between left versus right. And we all have to figure out ways to escape this. And the truth is, we're going to have to run through a lot of useful idiots to go ahead and be able to make a difference. And that's why for years I've been in the wrong side of a lot of political battles, because I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that what we need to do is seek truth. And so truth is a funny thing when it comes to people. We can talk about facts, but a lot of the story is about a narrative that's out there. And the narrative that's out there, this good, this bad, that's being pushed relentlessly, is setting up a lie that is not going to lead to anything but greater control being placed over you. It's not going to bring justice. It's not going to bring wealth. It's going to bring the equality of poverty. And it's going to have us reenact the Robespierre incident against ourselves, while people with a lot of money and means laugh at all of us. So I don't think you want that outcome, but we may end up there. And I will tell you that certain groups have shown themselves incredibly prone to manipulation, and I think that's the story in all of this. That we are all going down this track, but that real grievances are used to make people act in a way that is violent in frustration, speaking for what they believe are their interests in thought, but in reality works to the opposite. And I would submit to you the riots that are happening in these cities. And I will say they're riots at this point. I understand there are people legitimately protesting, but, this is long past being about police brutality, whether people realize it or not, and it's been co-opted. And I know people get mad at me, and I don't really care. I mean, it's fine. I'm just going to tell the story how it is, and if you don't want me to tell it that way, then you tell me, and I'll stop. And then I can go do other things with my time. But if you want to hear the truth, or at least a story you're not hearing elsewhere, let's go ahead and do it here. So we're going to go through a lot of stories today. It's going to be a longer episode than usual because I didn't give you guys an episode yesterday. So this is going to constitute episode, it's episode, 77, I think now. But ultimately, I'm going to kind of mix in almost a 78 as well, because I'm going to run long today, specifically because I didn't have a chance to give you the episode length that I feel like you deserved. We're on 78. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit longer one today. We'll probably run over 2 hours. But if we don't, that's fine too. And I want to tell the story this way. I want you to see the narratives. I want you to see the divergent narratives, and I want you to pull out what you think is true. And that's how we're going to talk about this. And when it's all done, here's what I want you to think about. Not who's right and who's wrong. What are your interests? What are your groups? What are the interests of your groups? And how can you sit at the table with people who don't share all your interests but could be your allies? And who is ultimately responsible for what we're experiencing? Is it a police officer in Minneapolis? Is it a black man who was asphyxiated or who died from a heart attack, as the coroner says? Or are these fights and factions that are out there, is it rural folk expressing privilege who are, basically doing what I do, mucking around and shit every day, causing the problems of the inner city poor? Or is it, black violence or minority violence inside cities that are threatening, people living in the countryside? Or is it a system that robs us from our wallets every single day of the year? What is the real threat? What is the danger? And ultimately, when you come up with a solution, here's the problem of our modern dialectic, and I'll just say it, I don't know how to put it. You can't create a victim without creating an oppressor. I've read Frantz Fanon. I've read all Antonin Gramsci. I understand Marxist theory on this. I understand it better than you guys do, because I had to. I went to Swarthmore. I mean, what the hell is called the Kremlin on the crop? And I understand the theory that there is systemic oppression of groups by other groups, and that's probably true to some extent. I mean, I have no doubt that there are advantages and disadvantages, and people use these shorthand methods to go ahead and have control. Nonetheless, if you present a situation where your group good, other group bad, you are in a zero-sum game, and you're going to fight. And if you want to go around, and this is where this revolution goes to, it ends up being a revolution where it says, hey, this is the movement of anti-whiteness against anti-blackness, well, then don't be surprised when you have a whole bunch of angry white people stand up and fight you, and then you end up in a civil war that ends up being a race war. The left has never understood, and they continue to not understand, that they create their own boogeyman. The reactionary movements on the far right have always been, every time in history, a reaction to the left, not realizing the equality that happens by seizing the means of production, right? That means stealing from people, ultimately ends up leading to the people who think they're getting stolen from standing up. And what I would submit to you is, rather than talking about seizing those means, we always end up technically talking about who's going to get what distributed to them. What we should be talking about is, how do we produce things that are worth things, and why is our labor and our capital not worth things? And if we think about why it is what we get doesn't get what we're worth, we begin to understand on a deeper level how we're all being screwed by the way the system works. And that's something we could change if we could have a conversation about it, but instead we like to fight over the scraps at our master's table. And that's the history of Western social movements for the last 200 years. People do not like to hear that. It offends them deeply because it tells you that everything you've been living is a lie. But why do you think corporations and banks donate billions of dollars to universities to teach you things so that you can radically undo the system, or because they're teaching you platitudes that make you basically subservient to them without you even knowing it? They give you the feeling, they give you the expression that you genuinely are changing the system, but you're not a threat to them. If you want to know who's a threat to the system, what you really need to look at is who gets shut down, who gets attacked. Now, yours truly, I've had the New York Times read 2 hit pieces against me, PayPal cancel me, and I'm a guy living in a cabin in Maine. I've had more systemic violence done to me than your average advocate that was out there who got sent to jail in the streets. Why? Because the ideas that are put into this program and put into some of my works are ones that could radically change the power structure. So if you believe in justice, and I think we all want justice, then you need a radically transformational idea. And whether it comes from a Christian monarchist who's an old white dude in a cabin, maybe there's something to it that you can take and apply to your life. And look, my job here is not to attack people for their ideas. I do think there are times we come to fights and arguments where we have genuine interest in issues between and betwixt one another that we can't resolve. And that's why I'm a separatist. I don't pretend, for instance, as a white guy, I can understand the problems of being black. I can talk about them, and I think I should be able to talk and have conversations. But if at the end of the day, black people say, hey, white people and black people just can't live together without these problems happening, I could be like, okay, well then how do we separate? Or what do we do? And then people say, oh no, you can't do that. Well, what's the choice? You can't have a situation where one group is in vassalage to the other indefinitely because of some presumed obligation. Those sort of obligations always need to be voluntary, and ideally you want them to be through kin and care, through faith and family, those sorts of things. Because if you force redistribution between A and B, all you're going to end up with is a system of perpetual resentment, which leads to revolution, which leads to control by a few over everyone who are set to fight one another. And if you begin to understand some of the more cynical ideologies out there, and I would suggest, and this could piss people off, that Marxism in a lot of ways is sort of a satanic ideology based on pride of people fighting one another for who's going to be in control, even though you're really trying to inherit the ashes of this earth rather than build to something higher. These are the sort of struggles that are out there, and I'm just giving you a glimpse into how I actually see the world, not because I expect you to agree with it, and not because I don't think dialectical reasoning isn't important. Go read Hegel by all means, understand what you're dealing with, but that we need to develop a new thing. And so what am I going to do going forward? Whether or not this show ends up being a piece of it, I believe in a radically different central approach. And when I say central, I don't mean centralized in central one person, but I mean that picks from what makes sense from the left and the right, and sometimes some ideas from the far left, maybe UBI, make a lot of sense, and some ideas from the far right make a lot of sense as well. The idea that you bring kinship back into the mix. So there's a lot of pieces, and we sit down and we talk about it, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to forge a different path, and at some point, I suspect, knowing myself, I'm going to do something stupid and get back involved with politics again and talk about things in a real, meaningful way. And because our government is failing us, our federal response is not capable of acting intelligently because the government is set at war against one another. The agencies don't work with the executive branch. The military is going its own way, and there's a lot of deep state actors floating around the edges of it. Governors might do something better. I hope they do. We'll see what ends up happening. I'm not very optimistic. And the people are being led down a lot of terrible paths. And I know that every now and then you need superior leadership to escape these things. And that we need a third way, just like we needed to save us from the virus, which, frankly, we didn't get, which has made this 100 times worse. And it may come back, and I think it will actually come back again. We also need the ability to go somewhere else with it. And so I'm going to tell you the story, and we're going to go peek into my brain, and if it's useful to you, you're listening, and if not, hey, you know what, nothing lost, and it was good to work together for a little while. So tell me what you think, share your ideas, and so I'm going to go into the stories here, and we're going to do one about coronavirus, and then we're going to do a whole lot on narrative. And I want you to see how you are seeing the world versus how someone else might be seeing the world. And you decide, I'm not saying any of them are true, but what I will say is the narrative itself becomes the story, that you have this divergent narrative that makes reconciliation impossible. And all this happens after coronavirus. So let's go ahead, and this piece is pretty short. So I just put this in there because I think it's important to understand that coronavirus starts this off, and it is no accident. The ex-head of MI6, and that is Britain's spy agency, and this piece is in the dailymail.com, published by Sophie Tano. It was published on June the 3rd. Ex-head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, says coronavirus is man-made and was released by accident after seeing important scientific report. Ex-MI6 chief, Sir Richard Dearlove, said that he believes COVID is man-made. Okay, we'll skip over those little bullet points. Here's the article. The former chief of MI6 has claimed that the coronavirus escaped from a lab in China by accident. Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the head of the MI6, a role informally known as C from 1999 to 2004, said he believes that COVID is man-made. He cited an important report from Professor Angus Dalgleish of St. George's Hospital, University of London, and Norwegian virologist Birger Sorensen, which claims the virus was manufactured in a laboratory. And there's a link in the article if you want to check this out. In the report, scientists claim to have identified sections placed on the SARS-2 spike surface, which the virus uses to attach onto cells, and observed they were significantly different from any SARS we have studied. And that's the PRA insert that you and I are very familiar with from the show. Sir Richard added that the report's findings could force China to pay reparations to the rest of the world due to the damage wrought by the virus. And I will tell you, China would rather fight a world war first, and they probably will. I do not think that this started as an accident, Sir Richard told the Telegraph's Planet Normal podcast. It raises the issue, if China were ever to admit responsibility, does it pay reparations? I think it will make every country in the world rethink how it treats its relationship with China. And I will tell you, we see this. India and Australia are having a major ongoing summit. Look for India, Australia, and Japan, backed by the United States, to represent an interest against China that's becoming increasingly formally set up. And it's no accident that Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, was actually invited to the next meeting of the G7. Alliances are shifting, as we see. The Anglosphere is coming back together, and we're looking at this years after Gandhi. It turns out those British roots are starting to show in India a little bit. Although I have no doubt that this is also driven by self-interest against the Chinese. The research claimed that current efforts to find a vaccine would prove unsuccessful, as scientists have so far misunderstood the true properties of COVID. Sir Richard suggested that the scientists at a laboratory in Wuhan could have secretly been carrying out experiments on bat coronaviruses when COVID-19 somehow accidentally escaped through a lapse in biosecurity. According to the former MI6 chief, the paper had been rewritten several times, and an earlier version apparently claimed coronavirus could accurately be called the Wuhan virus. An earlier version of the report, seen by the Telegraph, reportedly claimed beyond all reasonable doubt that the COVID virus is engineered. A previous investigation by the World Health Organization found that the virus jumped from bats to humans at the Wuhan wet market, where wild animals are kept in cages and slaughtered for meat. And I will say there's a lot of studies going on about how how the World Health Organization carried out for China, and it's important to recognize that Tedros is an Ethiopian communist who was basically very well funded by China to get in there. And, we've seen that people who have certain interests will work together. China got a lot of ability to get over things because the World Health Organization didn't push. And there's a lot of stuff out there on that if you want to research it. None of it will surprise you because we covered it even going back as far as February. And we've been watching this. And the thing is, one of the things you got to see happens is that things get memory hold. 2 weeks ago we were talking about how it was a risk to humanity to go out there and be out there and speak. And now we see people out by the millions, and the mainstream media has barely a whisper to say about the risks that are out there. And why? Because they're useful idiots who are being used to A, destabilize the system, and B, who are being put at risk because the system doesn't care if the millions of black protesters out there get sick. To them, it's even better because it makes the destabilization worse. So the very people who are applauding you on, who are giving you money to go out there for your protesters in the streets, you do realize they're using you like I hate to say it, and this is going to offend people, but basically you're just on a free-range plantation where your lives are being put in jeopardy so that you can be used to make a point that they want, which is they don't want this system here. And ultimately, it's terrible, and it's sad, and it's cynical, and saying that pisses people off, but it's the truth. And it's really obvious. You guys have been, all of my audience, the one thing you have in common is you take the virus seriously. What happens when you put a bunch of angry people into a position where they're going to get sick? A lot of people die, and the anger only heightens. And what is the media doing? Cheering it on like crazy. The media could have said, hey, George George Floyd's death was terrible, but we're going to stay home. We're going to have a silent vigil. What did they do? They did everything they could to push you out there. What did the corporations do? They paid for you to go out there and get sick. So, people attack me, Tom Kaczynski, infamous white supremacist. I feel like I'm the only person telling black people what they have to do to be safe. I mean, honestly, don't walk into this. How many times are you going to get played? You got to realize who's really screwing you. And it isn't some obscure white person in the country or someone sitting there, in a blue-collar job. It's an institutional prejudice. It's not these things. The people who are doing this, Minneapolis, that police department, you guys voted them in. Who is it? It's your leadership class that are in servant to your financial class. They're the ones who are screwing you. The educators who tell you you're victims. Anytime anyone tells you you're a victim, they're trying to control you. They're trying to make you feel helpless, because when you have insecurities and sensitivities like that, you can be manipulated. And take it from someone who's a politician, and a damn good one at that. If you want to manipulate people, you play to their fears. And that's what they're doing here. That's all they're doing. They play on us over and over again. They play us like fiddles, and we don't want to be there while Nero's fiddling and Rome is burning, okay? So understand that. That's a really big point of this. Let's see here. So yet late last month, a Chinese official admitted no viruses were detected in animal samples. At first, we assumed the seafood market might have the virus, but now the market is more like a victim, said Gao Fu, director of the Center of Disease Control and Prevention in China. So what are we seeing while everyone's looking at everything else? They're admitting, oh yeah, it was artificial, but it's not that big a deal. It went away. It is a big deal. 100,000 people plus died. I mean, I didn't even tell you the numbers today because honestly, they're just morbid. Latin America's getting crushed by this, and it's sitting in the background, and we're waiting for it to come up. And will it be that bad, or will it go away to be nothing? Who knows? We don't know. But we know this. We know that worldwide we've now had, all right, let's see what we got. We got 396,414 deaths. And this is COVID-19 Info Live, 6:20 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We're up here. America's chalking up another 1,000 deaths every day. Brazil, 1,471 deaths. They're up to 34,000 deaths. I mean, these are not people. And look, I understand that there are going to be people who are going to look at this and say, hey, did everyone who died of this actually die of COVID, or were they people who had COVID? We don't know. But we know people got sick and died well above what the basic numbers were. So some significant number of this 396,414 and some number beyond it that isn't even accounted for died from this event. And all the other people who suffered, all the businesses that were wrecked, all of these things that were done. And I told you that it was purposely a poor response designed to have certain problems. And I'll tell you the other problem I have too, just to be very blunt. I don't trust anyone. To me, there are no white hats. I don't trust Trump. I don't trust Obama. I don't trust Pelosi. I don't trust McConnell. I don't trust the governors. I sure as hell don't trust the media. I don't know who I trust. And that's the world. I mean, because people have agendas, and you have to learn to trust yourself and use logic. And I feel like friggin' Tinkerbell going around in Jiminy Cricket trying to give people little bits and pieces to understand how to read these stories. But this is what we're dealing with, and this is the world we have in reality. Now, I'm sharing this so that you realize that it's a mess, and there is no coherent story. There is no simple truth. There is no arc of justice. There is no redeeming narrative. And yet, as people psychologically, to understand our world, we have to build those. And so I found this story, and this was by Ted Anthony. I saw this in the AP, Associated Press, and I thought it was brilliant. And I want to share this story so you understand the problem. And maybe by the end of it, you'll see better why we can't get along. And this is called The American Story Splintered and Those Vying to Tell It. What does the United States of America mean? Perhaps it's storyline number one. Americans are a part of an epic tale of equality, of optimism and trajectory, a steady path toward prosperity that includes everyone from the melting pot working together to form a more perfect union. Its best days are still ahead. Maybe it's storyline number two. The United States was brutal, unfair from the get-go, colonized by quarreling white European factions that shared little but a tendency to overrun indigenous cultures and hold human beings as properties. Its best days, if there really were any, are receding. Or is it somewhere in between, countless shades of gray, infinite competing and overlapping visions of America, including many from those whose stories have been muzzled for a long time? The hard times that have befallen this nation in 2020, a deadly pandemic, millions unemployed, political warfare, the upheaval after George Floyd's death, have revealed an increasingly evident truth. The storylines that have long held the nation together are coming apart. The United States is essentially a collage culture, and if you were a certain group, you had the comfort of the solidity of the great American story. It had a coherence, says Robert Thompson, director of the Blyer Center for Television and Popular Culture at Syracuse University. And now it's been broken apart into a million little pieces. And I will interject something, because, I was actually running as a candidate, and I asked people a question that I think was really telling. I'm like, what is America? And if you ask 100 different people, you have 100 different answers. And some of the answers were very good, some were poignant, some were distressed. And I'm not saying they're valid or invalid. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that if you don't have a common answer, you don't have an America anymore. You have people cohabitating in a place. And that's what we have in this country. We don't have an answer, and we don't have a story. We have stories that are set at war against one another. And what is culture? Culture is what holds people together. It's what builds civilization. Culture are the truths you will fight to defend. That's all it is. And we don't have truths we will fight to defend we agree upon. We have conflicts that are not resolved. And that's why we're going to end up in a civil war, in my opinion, because we don't have an answer. And people have said to me, some very intelligent people have written me, and they say that, we've been through struggles like this before, the 30s, the 60s, and that's true. But we also had a much stronger America, and if the threats were more dangerous then, our ability to come together is far worse now, as is our division. I mean, demographically, the numbers are more set apart, people are angrier, we're more disconnected because of technology. I could give you all the 100 reasons we're not going to come together to beat this, and ultimately something new will likely emerge to change it, and odds are it'll be worse. That's history. Things don't get better from revolutions usually. They get ugly, and eventually things get rebuilt, and people end up trying to make the best they can. But this is where we're at, and if we're going to go with this, you need a compelling story. And that's why you guys listen to me. I'm a good storyteller. You need to be able to find one, and what we can't do is this, and this is what this article is saying. Since its inception, a nation lacking an existing shared culture instead built its identity on a series of stories. Exceptionalism, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equality, manifest destiny, the God-given right to expand, the American dream. We didn't have a story. We didn't have an ancient homeland. We had nothing, so you needed a story. People need stories of belonging, says Colin Woodard, author of the new book Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood. And Colin wrote a really good book about the different nations that are implicit in the American empire. I highly recommend it. Such stories emerged in the generation after the Founding Fathers died, and they grew with the nation, becoming more powerful even as they excluded many who populated American life. It was, in fact, a clash between storylines, the fundamentally different visions the North and South had for the country that precipitated the Civil War. That's true, and a lot of it was caught up in the economics as well. You had the agrarian South and the industrial North. Despite the fact we like to believe that the Civil War was fought over slavery, it was actually a peripheral issue, which doesn't excuse it, by the way. I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to justify slavery, but the truth is it was economically unsustainable and probably would have got wrecked in about 20 years, as it did worldwide for the most part. It wasn't until mass culture really emerged in the early 1900s, first movies and then radio and comic books and TV and finally grown-up advertising, that most Americans started hearing identical stories about their country, even if those stories didn't include them. An alignment centered in a potent national culture that was promptly upended by a 1960s counterculture that had a very different story to tell and no intention of being silenced. Still, many 20th century textbook notions, however outdated and broad brush, remain the baseline for how many talk about America. But now, 4 decades after 24-hour cable news made Walter Cronkite's reassuring and avuncular, "That's the way it is," quaint memory, the media landscape has cracked apart. A fragmented society is bursting at its seams, and as this week reveals, there's a free-for-all to determine which version of American story wins the day. What tales or myths about Americas do we cling to in the face of social upheaval? I think that's what we're struggling with here, says Shilpa Dave, a media studies scholar at the University of Virginia who teaches about representations of race and gender in media and popular culture. Who gets to pursue these ideals? That's what's in contention, she says. American mythologies are powerful and persuasive and comfortingly aspirational. After all, the world's largest economy became that way in part by selling narratives about itself back to its people across a dizzying array of platforms. And now social media, algorithms that sequester Americans in virtual gated communities where they reinforce existing beliefs instead of evolving the story with fellow Americans of other stripes. And I will say one other piece too. This is especially important for understanding America because, as the author said at the beginning, We don't have a natural story. We're mutts, every one of us. Whatever your race is, you came from different backgrounds. I mean, look at me. I'm Polish, I'm German, I'm Russian. I got a couple other little bits in there. This is where we are. And so we create one people, e pluribus unum, right? We made up a story that gives ourselves together. Just like the Romans said they were escapees from Troy, where they were suckled by a she-wolf. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous, but the Romans actually had rituals believing this. They have all these sort of things, or like the efforts, a lot of countries have these founding mythologies, and America relies on that much, much more than most, and we lean on it much more than most because what do we fall back on? We're not one people ethnically, we're not one people racially, we're not one people in kin, we're not one people in belief anymore. We don't have a unity to fall onto, and you can't have a United States of America without some source of unity. And even when people go out there and they aspire to something, they're not claiming something we can all latch onto. And you'll notice that all the provocateurs that get paid for ultimately go and they promote division in the end. And even if they say, we want to bring people for justice, A, B, and C against D, it's always in that confrontational mindset. And that's why nationalism is so rigidly attacked in all of its variants, because what it does is it tries to rebuild culture. But if culture comes together, culture is the enemy of economics. And I know that sounds, or finance, I should say. Culture talks about truths that will bring people together. Finance talks about ways you can draw people apart based upon using money as a wedge. And if you think about it, it's true, because markets are transactional goods where people have money placed on them, and ultimately we move away from qualitative views of things to quantitative. And I want you to share that because there are things you won't trade and things you will trade. And in America, whether you exist in the political market of ideology that kind of runs the left or the sort of finance-driven economic one of the right, what you realize is that culture is what's being destroyed. And this is one of the things I've been writing about for years, that you don't have a truth you can come back to. I mean, the French actually write really brilliantly on culture. And that's why I love the Québécois so much, because if you read them in French, it makes a lot of sense. You ultimately need to go ahead and have, instead of multiculturalism, you need what they call interculturalism, where you say, hey, I am part of a people that has value, you are part of a people that has value, and we can trade. And not to say you oppress our people, but rather, what can we do together? And it's a collaborative strategy instead of a competitive or, a confrontational one. Okay, but that is at the heart of this. So we look at this and we consider that in light of what we see in America today and how different this is. So let's continue. This landscape helps make Donald Trump surfing the waves of TV and Twitter so successful. A salesman at his core, he understands the mechanics behind storytelling and how to spin a tale that packs a wallop. The best and worst leaders build themselves out of stories, says James Poniewozik, writing in Audience of One, Donald Trump Television and the Fracturing of America, his 2019 book. They use their culture's language to express what literal language can't. And so you have Trump atop the bulliest pulpit in the land, characterizing the American story Monday night. Our country always wins. That's why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore the security and safety in America. And then you have his challenger, Joe Biden, characterizing it this way on Tuesday. American history isn't a fairy tale with a guaranteed happy ending. The battle for the soul of this nation has been a constant push and pull for more than 240 years, a tug of war between the American ideal that we are all created equal and the harsh reality that racism has long torn us apart. What's happening in American cities over the past week shows, among many other things, a vision of storylines at war. Over and over, protesters speak of wanting to be heard, of having their stories shape the larger story, needing the central myth of American life to include them. Just as vigorously, those triggered by the tumult tell an impassioned story of order, calm, and the right to be safe in one's home and business, something central to the American story right back to the first settlers. For the moment, these different stories seem utterly irreconcilable. Many are not primed to hear their fellow Americans' stories right now. Polarization was already impeding things. Then came the pandemic's existential threat. And now the oldest of contentious American storylines, race, has taken the lead role. How does one forge a sense of shared purpose? How does one forge shared... That's a weird sentence. How does one forge shared a sense... It should be, how does one forge... God, I'm just flubbing the sentence. It's written really weird. How does one forge shared a sense of purpose out of this? How do Americans reassemble the portrait from its fragments? We can't exist as 1,000 little pieces, Dave says. We all want to believe in the story, that we are all created equal and we all have the right to pursue life, liberty, justice, and happiness. Those are values we all cling to. The journey to get there, that becomes what we've struggled against in history and what we're struggling against now. It is clear the 20th century of the American story no longer works. But in this country of stories, not having one won't work either. Does a nation cease to exist when its foundational story breaks apart? When those who tell that story are saying different things? On the night before he was assassinated in 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. summoned the story he believed had been promised to him and his compatriots. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. Everywhere in the nation today, on the streets and in the halls of government, people are summoning their version of the American story, shouting on it, insisting on it. Certain is the version that that must prevail. What we know now, after a crazy quote century of movies and TV and advertising and social media, is that the people who tell the richest, loudest, most immersive, most appealing story can, in fact, rule the world. What will that new American story be? And that's the question we're at. What is the story we're going to be? Will it be a divisive story? Will it be something that's angry? Or can we get something better? I don't know. I'll tell you the story I tell, because I was telling it before this happened. And I'll tell you my values, because I'm going to go out there and talk about them, because I don't know the right story. I know the story I want to believe, so I'm going to tell the story. And, it's a funny thing. People laugh at me. I had a guy in our group, good guy. I think it was Duhan. If people don't, not that it matters, I share his thing. But he was saying to me, he's like, a month before coronavirus broke out, I was listening to all these mainstream sources, and now I'm listening to this guy who calls himself the king of New England. And it's funny, because I was working on a monarchist program for the upper Northeast, which is brilliant and totally novel in a lot of ways. Although it borrows from history, of course we all do. We stand on the shoulders of giants, no question of that. And it was only when I started to re-envision how I looked at myself and my relationship, not as a passive citizen of a decaying empire, but as a leader for a potential future vision of our country, of a new nation founded with principles that were different, that I changed my own behaviors. And so I share this personal anecdote because how you see yourself in the story changes how you act, what responsibilities. And it keeps me from being, I could go out there, I'm kidding, I could go out there in 15 minutes, become a national news story, and grab together Maine in resistance to whatever I wanted. I have those sort of connections. I've worked at this a long time, and I've built those, and that's why I understand certain things, how people behave in the field, the real challenges. But I don't want to go out there and willy-nilly just say, hey, I'm going to play into a narrative. I want a new narrative, and I think we need to ask that narrative as we look at the ones that are out there. And, in my writings, I always talk about 4 key values. And maybe this is the new American story, or maybe this is the new, who knows, Albionner story. That's what I work on. But I think they're good values, and I think regardless of what happens, you will do well in your life to approach them, and I'll share them with you as part of a story that helps you become a better person, and that's what a story needs to do. A story that's going to work can't say, hey, we are victims and we're attacking these people, or that these people exist and they're an existential threat to us, because that's what the left and right-wing stories have become, where we have to fight one another. And at the end of it, you're always going to be looking for a new enemy. That's the problem. You're always going to need that angry other. And if you really want to escape the cycle of violence, if you really want to do that, you need to figure a project we can all work on together. For me, it's very simple. Reason. The world has rules. We understand them. We look at them. We're honest about them. Put truth at the center. Good things follow. Nature. We live in a world of finite resources. That is a beautiful thing. Let's appreciate it, not just try to monetize everything all the time. Money isn't what defines us. It's the world we live in. It's what sustains us. Grace, that we will be a little kind to one another and try to go ahead and be better people. It's an aspiration. We're never going to get there. We need to be more forgiving rather than vengeful. That's it. And, God willing, it's a story the Lord tells us about how we should live. It's a good story for Christians and non-Christians alike. And loyalty. I'm going to put people above systems, and I'm still doing it, and it's hurting me. It's hurting me immensely. But we need to do that. We need to be honest with one another. And honesty, commonality of purpose, decency, that's what makes loyalty possible. And I don't care about systems. I want to go wreck things too. I want to go wreck the banks. I want to go burn the banks $1 bill at a time and tell them to go straight to hell. And that's my opinion. That's what I'll march with people on that. I even talk to people on the left. I was like saying, hey, what fight can we have together? They're like, well, you don't understand. You're white. I'm like, if you want to fight me, if you're going to make it where we have to be against one another, that's fine. You can fight me and I'll probably win. But I don't want that fight because I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. I know you're mad. I know you've been fucked. Sorry, I shouldn't curse like this, and I apologize for that. But that's the truth, and in real life, I curse. If you ever listen to my Friday night show, I'm actually a little bit more colorful in what I say. But and it's not a good thing, but I just do it. It's fine. I'll try not to. But ultimately, I know that anger. I get it. You're not alone. And the reason you're screwed might be different. Yeah, that's true. And I'm not discounting it. I don't want to discount it, and I want you to find what makes you happy. I mean, I'll be honest. I don't know if we can do it together at this point. I don't necessarily think so. But I'm willing to talk about it, and I want to hear your voice. But I'm not going to say, hey, no, you have to sit down and shut up and listen. No, I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to keep talking, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to engage you. I'm not going to let you lecture at me. I'm not going to let you enact some fantasy. But you have legitimate interest, and your legitimate interest and your legitimate grievances should be considered. So as we go forward and we hear these different stories, hear the interest of the other people, talk to them, and consider it, just consider it. You don't have to agree. I mean, I read stuff every day that I fundamentally disagree with. And look, if it comes down to it, I'm forced to go on either side. It's no secret. I'm a rural guy in the country, white dude. I lean right of center. And I'm a social conservative. I believe in some economic redistribution. But I believe in values, and I understand that if certain people come to power, they will decide to make me a criminal, and I'll have to fight them probably to the death. That's the world I live in. I've lived at too high of a level for me to have a simple choice. Most of you, God willing, have been smarter than I was in dragging my poor wife into a fight of ongoing conflicts where we have been a football in a game, not our own, and just trying to get our own footing when you're always being kicked around as a challenge. But that's what you're in now. You're in the game, and you have to figure out a way out of it. Otherwise, you just end up getting bounced by others. And don't let people bounce you, man. Understand your interest, and understand that your ability to work with anyone, whether you agree or disagree, is transactional. You have allies you don't expect, and your friends are often your enemies in the end. And I don't know how else to put it. And anything that's given to you too easy is probably something you don't want to trust too much. Is that cynical? Perhaps. But, I mean, you've watched what happened with coronavirus. You've watched what authorities and institutions did. You watched how the media lied to you for years. You watched how your international institutions didn't tell the truth. And you watched how the political parties on both sides gamed you. So if you're ready to be a free-thinking individual and you're ready to be part of a group that does something, hey, welcome to the Radical Center. Good to have you. And maybe that's what I'm going to call my show. I think I'm going to rename it Radical Center. That's what I believe. And we'll try. And it's a conversation. I talk to people on radical left, radical right, center right. It doesn't matter. We are the focal point of our own future. Each one of us individually has to do that. And if we do it collectively, maybe we can avoid a human tragedy. I don't know if we will, but I think that at a minimum, more of us will survive. I can do my job to help keep you safe, and we can help rebuild it faster, because I think that's what we're looking at. Because, realistically, what are we? We're a drop of water in a bucket, but who knows? It's like, in my best moments, I imagine a drop of green dye dropped into a blue bucket can change everything in clear water, Maybe it can, maybe it can't. We'll see. So I want to show you how things look differently. So we're going to go 3 different ways with narratives on this, and then we're going to look at some of the outcomes, just to give you a feel for where this is going before we go into next week. And this one was published, I got it from Drudge, actually, but the website's called McSweeney's.net, Internet Tendency, and it's called Daily Humor almost every day since 1998. And we could use a little bit of laughs. But this piece was by Abik Promanik, and it was published on June 3rd, and I want you to read this because I asked some people on the evening podcast, which will have a good show tonight, by the way, 7 p.m. YouTube. Come be there, come in, and you can ask whatever questions and hear me rant while I drink scotch. It's always a good time. What will end up happening is that we end up looking at this question of how we would tell the story if we were just looking at the pictures and images and didn't have any context. And so this guy really took it to the next level, and he did a really funny and great, but also poignant job in this. If war correspondents reported on American protests in the same way they reported on protests in other countries. And here's how it would sound if you presented it like an AP piece. Mass protests and violent riots have broken out in multiple American cities over the past week after the murder of an ethnic minority by heavily armed paramilitary forces was captured on camera in the city of Minneapolis. This site of repeated instances of state-sponsored terrorism, this once idyllic city in the American Midlands, is now considered ground zero of a nationwide democratic uprising. In response to the killing of George Floyd, a multi-ethnic coalition of Americans have taken to the streets to protest the United States' heavy-handed security apparatus. Remarkably, these protests have organically spread throughout America's major cities, despite ongoing concerns about the renewed transmission of COVID, reflecting the depth of anger shared by ethnic minorities in the U.S. after centuries of persecution. America's rising death toll from the novel coronavirus, the worst in the world, has disproportionately afflicted the historically oppressed African-American group in the U.S. thanks to deep inequalities in the nation's crumbling public health infrastructure. Complicating matters, President Donald J. Trump, America's populist authoritarian leader, hails from the country's majority racial group and has fanned the flames of ethnic and religious tension throughout his presidency. Instigated by President Trump and other right-wing extremist security forces monitoring these protests, in recent days have brutally cracked down on peacefully assembled Americans and foreign correspondents. In response, violent elephants unaffiliated with the protest movement have begun setting the property of major corporations ablaze, prompting the intervention of American military forces and raising fears of a significant escalation in the conflict. While the UN Security Council has yet to make a formal statement on the events that have unfolded thus far, world leaders, including Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif, have condemned America's slide into violence and have floated the use of sanctions on officials close to President Trump to help protect America's ethnic minorities. Disregarding pleas from the international community to peacefully resolve the crisis, U.S. President Donald Trump has retreated to a secured bunker where he has doubled down on threats of violence against demonstrators, on public statements on Twitter, a platform he has often used to spread misinformation and incite racial conflict. Concerned about the security of their nation's respective borders, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador have called for a trilateral summit to help mediate tensions. However, it is unclear yet if President Trump will accept their invitations. Quietly, contingency plans are also being drawn up at NATO headquarters in Brussels to establish a no-fly zone over select American cities to protect protesters if matters worsen. As the fragile state on the precipice of instability, the United States continues to draw the world's attention. But can this transitioning democracy hold on long enough before it fractures in place? It's a hell of a story, really. And you know what? From a certain perspective, it's true because it doesn't have context and you present it certain ways. And I want you to see this. Because there's a lot of truth in it, and there's a lot of things that might piss you off, and yet this is it. And what we live in an age of peak propaganda, where people tell stories, and the stories create the truth. And the story you've been told your whole life, I will tell you, from the time you were in elementary school, from the time you were a young kid, from the time, even these days, you get a touchscreen at friggin' 3 years old, it's ridiculous, is meticulously curated to lead you to a certain set of conclusions. You know, it's like Scott Adams says. He says this brilliantly, the hypnotist who does the Dilbert cartoons, that what we are given is we are moist robots that basically have outputs dependent on our inputs, and you are fed certain inputs depending upon, you know, your wealth, your status, your schooling, your race, all those things. And if you go to different experiences, or you have different backgrounds, or if you read, you don't need formal education for this, you begin to realize that the story is more complicated. There's much more choice involved in this world than you would assume, and that's an empowering thing. But that you're not told you have those choices. You're told you have desperate situations, because a desperate person will act in predictable ways. And why would the system want you to be desperate? Because desperate people can be controlled, and that's what we deal with. And so when we look at this, we see that our whole political drama is set up in that way, from the president on down through. And while we each sympathize with different characters in the morality play, I think it's important to realize that we become participants in the play, and we do have the ability to walk outside of that play. We do have the ability to define ourselves differently, and you pay a high price. Look, I've chosen to do that. I was painted a certain way for saying things that weren't what I said, and that's what they do, and that's what the media does. And the media is evil. I don't know how else to put it to you. It's one of the reasons that's a real irony of my broadcast. I'm part of the very thing I hate, but I had to come in here to try to subvert it to make a difference, because the reality is, unless I tell my story, all that happens is someone tells a story about me, and people don't even bother to question it because, hey, that fits what you think you know. And I think that's true, and I would say that's just true what I do, and I'm guilty of this. I admit it. I do it every day, 100 times a day, because we all do it. I look at people who are not like me, or who I don't draw empathy with as easily, and I say, hey, I don't know their story. I'm not there. And so why do I talk so much about stories, and why am I doing this? Because I want you to see culture comes to stories, and what stories can we agree upon. And I guess as I'm realizing this, I realize my job, you know, one of the funniest things about this show is, honestly, it's like my own psychological self-help session. And I try to figure out how I'm going to deal with a world I'm fundamentally unhappy with, uncomfortable in acting in, and yet know that I have some responsibility either because I internally feel that way or because, it helps people externally, who knows, to do that. And I realized that I have to tell a different story. I have to tell the story I believe in, and I have to realize that this story's out there. And I would say to each and every person listening, you have to tell a story that makes sense. And the reason we spend so much time looking at all these contradictory points is we're pulling out the lies. And there's a lot of lies, including lies we cherish, by the way. And I think it's okay to have aspirations, okay? But I think the problem is the sin America makes is we treat our aspirations as truths, right? That on the right, we have the truth that we are all equal. And it's not true. You're screwed if you're a minority in a lot of ways, and it's true. And we should be honest about that. But also, the idea that all people are equal is another lie. It's an aspiration. It's a truth we wish was true. But it's not, and we have to admit people are different, and that's why we have divergent outcomes. And whether it's genetics or culture or personality or honestly some combination of them, it makes it complicated. And we want to have things we know, and we don't know anything. I mean, I on a personal level, I think the only thing we can control in this world is how we respond to events around us. We can either be thankful or grateful or angry or acting or any of these things, but these are the choices that are given us, and that's the world we have to live in. And so we have to figure out how we're going to tell a different story. So I want you to see what the story looks like here. I'm going to tell you the left-wing version of what's happening. We're going to have 2 stories from the left, and then we're going to have 2 stories from the right. And that story, I will tell you, that story had kind of a leftist bend to it, but that's okay. And then we're going to take a real quick look at some things that are happening, and I will comment on them. So this piece is coming to me via The Hour, but it was originally written in the Washington Post. I think it's something they do as a sort of trick because the Washington Post has put up a paywall, and a lot of people have learned to do this. So this piece is by Christine Adams in the Washington Post, and she writes, "Are we on the brink of revolution?" And I want to say to you, to the people who are listening to this, the media is trying to stoke these flames. Maybe because they think it helps Trump, maybe because it helps them make money, maybe because their patrons want to see the system fall, maybe all of these reasons. And remember, at different levels, people do things for different reasons. A guy owns a business. He's doing it to make a lot of money, and he's doing it because he has a vision. But a guy who's a middle manager is probably just there to get a paycheck or to advance himself. That you have competing agendas collaborating to accomplish things obviously confuses a story. It always happens. Okay, so let's go. The protests that have erupted across the United States following the brutal deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others at the hand of police fit a pattern of long-term structural patterns meeting sudden crises that have historically shaped revolutions in the past. And I want to tell you part of the story. When you're telling a story, it's not just what pieces you put in, but it's what pieces you put out. There are a number of white people who have died from white police officers committing the same sort of police brutality actions that could very easily be included in this story to go ahead and develop a different narrative to say the problem with police violence is something that goes across all political cultures and races where we have seen the rise of a state more determined to control the people. You could tell that story, but you'll notice the media never tells that story. So you need to ask yourself not only what are they including, but what are they excluding? Because usually the biggest lie you tell is a lie of omission, and you begin to understand that, which doesn't take anything away from George Floyd, but did you know that more police murders by percentage happen where white cops kill white assailants as opposed to black assailants? Crazy, but things you don't know about the story. And so when you look at this, you need to understand how the manipulation's happening. The idea of police brutality against people is not something anyone should support, but there are these facts out there to be found that don't fit into the narrative, and they get memory hold. They never come up in anything. And what is that? That's editorial control of a hostile media. And what does that hostile media represent? The interest of the status quo to which it belongs. As we grapple with what might change in the wake of COVID and unrest across the country, the case of the French Revolution of 1789 reminds us of the contested nature of social change. Keep in mind, yesterday, I'm just going to insert this. On Twitter yesterday, Antifa was trying to compare itself to the Democratic protesters in Tiananmen Square. The difference was the Democratic protesters in Tiananmen Square weren't on the sides that were cracking heads all over the place. And if you don't believe Antifa does that, I could show you story after story after story after that. But I just want you to see this, that people are always trying to propagandize themselves into the best light and their enemies into the worst sort of light. You can do that, but if you do that, then you make fights inevitable. And people do that because that's the shortcut to change. You remove your enemy from the equation, whether you unvoice them or you ultimately fight them or you kill them. It's the same thing. And this is how nations are built. And, there's a theory out there that goes that conflict is the basic nature of human species, that we're constantly in conflict and peace is the exception. It's a compelling theory, and as we're going through these times, it's worth keeping in mind. Revolutions do not necessarily erupt at the moment when people are most depressed. Rather, revolutions have more often been the result of rising expectations. Period of progress followed by crushed hopes can be especially dangerous, leading to rage and violence. Alexis de Tocqueville was one of the first political theorists to highlight what he viewed as a curious paradox. The French Revolution erupted not when the nation was in the throes of decline, such as during the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, in the later years of the reign of Louis XIV, that's the Sun King, but rather at a time of relative prosperity in France. In his words, a study of comparative statistics makes it clear that in none of the decades immediately following the revolution did our national prosperity make such rapid forward strides as in the two preceding it. In fact, those parts of France that had experienced the greatest improvement saw the most pronounced popular discontent in the late 1780s, and these became centers of revolutionary activity. And so you look at who is actually winning in this world, right? Or who has the most money in America? It's the big cities. It's your New Yorks, it's DCs, and it's those places where you see the rioting. You don't see rioting in the poor rural areas where, people still have a belief in certain things. You see it in the cities. It's an irony that people need to have aspiration. And as you look at who's actually doing better, it's curious that geographically, and maybe it's the disparity between what they see, between what would mostly be progressive elites in the cities and the poor urban underclass that's heavily minority, but they tell you the people at the top write papers saying, blame these people, not us. And since they're there and they say nice things to them, they believe the trash that's said about them. And that's one of the problems. You have to understand the manipulative nature of what media does. But people don't. And I know they're not going to, because honestly, they're louder. And, reason doesn't necessarily win, especially when people are so good at propaganda. I mean, they put Goebbels to shame, to be sure. All right, so Tocqueville attributed this to King Louis XVI's relatively light hand over the country and the desire to lessen the weight of absolutist rule, for it is not always when things are going from bad to worse that revolutions break out. On the contrary, it more often happens when a people which has put up with an oppressive rule over a long period without protest suddenly finds the government relaxing its pressure. It takes up arms against it. However, historians have identified other factors. And I will say Tocqueville is brilliant. His book, Democracy in America, is always very relevant. He said, the moment America ceases to be a good country, it will cease to be a great country. And he talked about our rural simplicity of life and how that got away. I mean, part of my personal narrative, I'm very sympathetic to that. But, of course, the 19th century was a different universe. Anyway, yes, the lives of many French people were improving in the second half of the 18th century as epidemic disease and food shortages became less common, allowing for a decline in mortality. Overseas and domestic trade increased over the course of the century, making consumer goods such as sugar and coffee more widely available. The slave trade and the labor of enslaved people on plantations in Caribbean colonies for France fueled the availability of these goods as well as French prosperity more generally. And Louis XVI, influenced by an Enlightenment philosophy that called upon kings to rule in the interest of their subjects, did take into consideration the well-being of the French people. But things were not, in fact, going well in France in the years immediately preceding the revolution in 1789. Although I would say that despite the disparities in terms of absolute wealth, there's never been minorities. Actually, to tell you the truth, there's never been black people with more wealth in the aggregate than there are in average in America today. And of course, that doesn't apply to everybody, and that's heavily skewed by a few rich people, but opportunity exists. You got affirmative action, you got all sorts of different programs in place, and, how do you deal with that? How do you square these stories that don't fit? And everyone omits the facts they don't want to have out there. And look, I do it too. I absolutely do it. I admit it. And we should be honest about it. And that's why I'm talking now the only way I can talk, which is to try to tell a new story and give you a new framework. And I'm going to keep pushing it every single episode until we adopt it, because it's a better framework. And if you don't think it's a better framework, hey, there's other shows, You guys, a couple of you send gifts, and I'm very grateful. But ultimately, you're not paying for this, so I can say what I want. At the same time, the French government was grappling with bankruptcy, a legacy of its 18th century wars, including its assistance to the American revolutionaries. One of the things you see over and over again in history is regimes collapse when they're overextended from financial spending for wars. The UK lost its empire because it used all of its weight to fight Germany. The Soviets ended up overextending themselves in Afghanistan. And how much money have we wasted in the Middle East trying to change people who've been the way they are for literally, forget centuries, millennia longer than we've even existed? The dire state of French finances was made public in 1786 when the last of the wartime taxes expired and it became clear the government was running a serious deficit. Remember that $25 trillion America owes? Looks familiar, doesn't it? The Comptroller General tried to impose reforms to solve the fiscal crisis, including a broad-based tax, but was met with stiff resistance. And you couldn't do it here either. The decision to call the Estates General to bring about financial and political reform, including a new constitution for the country, provided the catalyst for social unrest and violence, including the storming of the Bastille and the Great Fear, a series of peasant riots fueled by panic and conspiracy theories that spread across the French countryside in the summer of 1789. The grim situation that the French faced in 1788 was made even worse by the fact that those suffering knew that life could be better. Why? Because they had a glimpse into a better future. The popularization of Enlightenment literature that critiqued inequalities in the social and political system, along with the politicization of French citizenry that had accompanied elections of the Estates General, convinced many French men and women that political representation and a more just polity could bring about genuine change. This fuller picture conforms to the late sociologist James Chowning Davies' theory of political revolution, which suggests that revolutions are a response to a downturn in the economy after a significant period of growth that allows individuals to envision a more promising future. I'm not familiar with his theory, but it sounds interesting, and I know there's some historical weight to it. A population subjected to unmitigated poverty and oppression cannot imagine a better alternative and consequently is unlikely to revolt. However, as life begins to improve and a happier life is conceivable, a sudden reversal of fortune can seem unbearable and trigger revolutionary activity. This theory offers one way of thinking about the outbreak of revolution in France in 1789. The economic crisis of the years 1787 to 1788 created new and insufferable hardship throughout the country, while a changing political culture, informed by Enlightenment philosophy, convinced many people that a more capable government could alleviate the hardship of its citizens. Rising expectations, dashed by economic downturn and royal incompetence, meant that the people of France were ready to take to the streets. This theory may be playing out once again today. The gains of the civil rights movement made it possible to imagine a future of racial equality was within reach, and when Barack Obama became president, it represented to many a powerful symbol of progress. But enduring inequality and police violence, a highly visible white backlash that emerged in response to Obama's election, have been crushing. The COVID pandemic and the collapse of the economy have thrown into prominence the sharp disparities in this country and exacerbated the stress and anguish of those suddenly facing economic catastrophe. These dashed expectations of a better life made recent incidents of police brutality, assertion of white privilege, and other acts of racial violence all the more intolerable. It is not surprising that the murder of George Floyd was the match that lit the fuse. And so that is the standard media leftist narrative. So I want to break, though, this last thing here. So one of the things that ended up happening, though, is that we've seen some of this, but they put that phrase in there over and over again of white privilege, which is, the reality is, if you look at white population in America, that in the aggregate, you have suicides going up markedly, drug use becoming a major problem, especially in rural areas. The heroin epidemic is to the white community in this decade what the cocaine problem was to the black community, or crack in the 80s. And in the same sort of way, there's a lot of deep state fingers all over that. And so the idea you're put up to is you have these people who are out there with a narrative saying that whites caused the problem. And they go out there and they yell at people who are in the country who ultimately didn't get any benefits. They didn't get rich. And were there a few white people? Yeah, there were a few white people. There were people in the cities who made a lot of money, you know. There were a lot of minorities, few whites, few Jews, few different groups of people that made a lot of money. And that, yeah, they did well. They did, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people did horribly, and that we are put into this thing where they say, attack them, not us. And this is why you have to define your story differently. And this is why the media is doing an incredible disservice. The media is causing the race war. It's not white supremacy, believe me. I know, I mean, look, I will tell you, you name any person who is a supposed white supremacist, I could get in touch with them in 5 seconds. All of them are just sitting back watching this, thinking, you know, and look, some of them are good people, some of them are bad people, just like any other group. And they would tell you they're sitting back watching this because it's not them driving this. It's the media driving it. It's the government driving it. I mean, we're as powerless as anything else. You know, and that's true of the black activists, the white activists, the social change organizers. I mean, we can go and walk between the lines, right? And even if the lines are allowed to like blow up certain corporate things, it's still certain lines. If I went out there 10 minutes from now and said, hey, I got a militia of 100 people, you would literally have the whole weight of the U.S. military go out there and fight this. So this is a theatrical play. I want you to understand this. But the point that what it is a time of rising finance and wealth. And let's be honest, black unemployment's never been lower, right? Black wealth has never been higher as a total group, and minorities have never had more say in America. I mean, honestly, what is America? 62% white now. So, I mean, that's the smallest it's ever been in history. We're at a tipping point where it probably does change and it becomes a different country because different people, different groups, different beliefs. It's just the way it is. It's not right or wrong. It's a decision that was made, and the mistake, if there was one, or, well, I see it as a mistake, but let's just put it more neutrally. The assumption that was made by the white majority is that there was a universalist set of values that everyone would subscribe to. The ultimate form of imperialism, you're going to think like I do if you see the same things, and minorities did not. And part of that was they were propagandized, but part of it's natural too, and that's okay. It's not their fault. It's not our fault. It's the way it is. But their, universal values have their weaknesses, and unless you can convince people of them, obviously nobody did. So now we have this problem where we have a revolutionary period where things got good, and we accepted things were good, and we expected to be bribed in the various ways we were, whether that meant working or getting direct government subsidies, the same sort of thing. Ultimately, you accept you have a certain place in the game, and you are happy enough to not revolt, and now everyone's losing their place in the game. And you're only hearing one side of the story, but we'll say the unrest from the countryside is just as pronounced. It's presented as the evil side of the equation, that people want to go back to the bad old days of Christianity, where families stayed together and they raised their children. My God, how awful. How regressive, where one person could work and make enough money to support the family. You didn't have to have two people work. I mean, you could tell the narrative however you want. You can make it sound like a second-wave feminist theory about oppression, or you can make it sound about parents who cared enough where one could stay home and raise their kids because life mattered more than money. Money is the ultimate tool by which you're manipulated. I have to share that with you, and that's out there, regardless of whatever your political ideology is, and both leftists and rightists are incredibly guilty of it. So I want to share these sort of stories and put this out there so you can see this narrative is put together in certain ways. So I'm going to share a piece here from Russia Today, which is interesting, but it's actually from a left-wing perspective, which you wouldn't expect from Russia Today. And it's from, the author's name is Danielle Ryan. She's an Irish freelance writer based in Dublin. Says in her works appeared in Salon, The Nation, Rethinking Russia, whatnot. And if she was in The Nation, I guarantee you she's far left of center. That's just how that magazine rolls. But it's interesting. And it does speak to the hypocrisies in this. I think it's fair. U.S. gun nuts said they needed firearms to resist tyranny. When it came, they cheered. A prevailing argument made by ardent pro-gun conservatives in the United States is that a heavily armed citizenry is imperative, lest the need arise to fight government tyranny. But when that tyranny came, they cheered in support. Gun rights debates in the U.S. invariably involve pro-gun evangelists invoking the Second Amendment right to bear arms as the highest safeguard of American liberty. A citizen militia, they say, will preserve freedom and democracy. Gotta make this bigger because I can't read it. Because the people can rise up in arms literally to keep authoritarian tendencies at bay. There are reams of evidence and data pointing to the fact that this argument is false, and preservation of democracy does not, in fact, rely on high civilian gun ownership. And actually, she's right about that, but the preservation of liberty does, and liberty and democracy are often competing values. Weird, but true. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that those who prefer this pro-guns everywhere reasoning actually wholeheartedly believe it. With that assumption, we would expect to see equal levels of disgust and anger over the events of the past week from both the left and the right. Pro-civil liberty conservatives will put their politics aside and be appalled by the treatment of their fellow Americans, witnessing out-of-control state violence. They would call upon protesters to take arms against the tyrannical regime. After all, that's what the Second Amendment was intended for, right? But of course, that's not how it happened at all. When Donald Trump stood in the White House Rose Garden on Monday evening and threatened to unleash the full force of the American military on American citizens, many of his supporters applauded and extolled his leadership skills. This reaction, if nothing else, proves that their opposition to government tyranny is paper-thin, purely conditional, and partly political. The rest of the world has been watching in horror as U.S. police plow into peaceful protesters, tear gas kneeling, and nonviolent demonstrators, hit journalists with rubber bullets, fire flashbang grenades into crowds that include children, arrest people for merely speaking, and beat others to a bloody pulp, all on camera. And all of this is framing, right? Because if you look at it, and I'm not saying they're not both accurate. One side looks at it as protests that are going out there to express their right to anger about injustices they perceive, and the other side of it sees it as riots where people are wrecking their own things. And they're both right. I mean, that's what's tricky. How do you want to see it, right? Those of us who call out the hypocrisy of other people who claim to support individual rights and small government are met with the argument that Trump's threats and police actions are justified to deal with rioting and looting. The retort to those condemning police thuggery and Trump's handling of the crisis generally sounds something like, yeah, well, we aren't looting and setting things on fire. This is a straw man argument. And first off, it's not a straw man argument. I want to be very clear. And I'm inserting here, it's an argument that's based upon the fact that someone worked to make those things. Someone did that. That there was someone's life that was destroyed. Oftentimes in these places, most sadly in Minneapolis, of black entrepreneurs who had to work extra hard to succeed. I feel terrible for them. Anyways, this is a straw man argument offered for the purposes of deflecting the conversation away from police brutality and shifting the focus off imperative discussions about systemic racism and injustice at the root of U.S. society. You see, this is her narrative. This is her belief. And what you find, and I'm going to share this in media, because both sides do this, but you need to learn how to do this if you want to actually read what's being said. People basically make a whole case to defend their point. Her point is to point out systemic racism and injustice at the root of society. She starts this article basically with a belief she hides in the middle of it. And in our thing being hidden at the middle of it, she builds a whole narrative around to make you agree with her belief. And this is how persuasion happens. We all do it. I do it, she does it. And I'm not saying she's wrong and I'm right, or I'm right and she's wrong. But I want you to see how that works. So what you have to learn to do is understand, and this is what people don't understand. They don't understand their core beliefs by which they're being motivated, manipulated, and maneuvered. And that's what happens on and on and on. If someone says, hey, these people take advantage of you, and then you go to a group of people and say, these people are to blame, they're taking advantage of you, they play on the sensitivity that is pre-intellectual, and that you go ahead and you're made to jump, and we all do it. And believe me, I'm fighting it like crazy. I mean, I'm sitting here at the edge of this, watching what's being basically maneuvered into a race war, thinking, do I have to fight this? And then if enough people do so, choices are taken away from the rest of us in a lot of ways, just because survival requires that we survive what's in front of us, not the world we wish would be, but the world that is, and that's real politics. But let's go ahead and see what else she has to say. Because there is injustice, I agree with that. I mean, the systemic the systemic racism, People on the left think racism is the primary motivating factor. They don't understand that races being played against each other is a function of a political system trying to create stability that Lyndon Johnson directly said. He said, quote, and you go find it, I'm going to have these blanks, and the blank is a 6-letter word that begins with an N, going out there, voting for us for 100 years because I'm going to go ahead and make them dependent and go forward and support us. And he did that, and that's what the Civil Rights Act did. It basically decided to make minorities in a lot of ways dependent on the government, and rather than seeking true integration, it actually created division, and that's what the 60s counterculture did. Whether they did it on purpose or not is a question you can ask. I could present to you a very compelling case, and one day I will, perhaps, that in fact it was done quite deliberately. You can read people like Antonin Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse, and these are people who are taught in universities that are the key to understanding the way the modern left thinks, the leadership of the radical left, but you're never taught those names. You're told other stories because you're not allowed to read the manuals, the how-to manuals. And there's other books I've told you about, how the elites in the banking system control things. I mean, the information's out there if you have the balls to look for it. But it's ugly, and it's an uglier world where people use people to an extent you would not believe, but that's the oldest conspiracy in history, is it not? And that's the real system. People on the top will do whatever they have to do to stay on top. It goes back to the Tower of Babel, and it hasn't gotten much better since Nimrod, okay? In reality, anyone who has been closely observing the unrest of recent days will be fully aware that the militarized police forces are responding with overwhelming force and violence to peaceful protesters, not simply the fringe group of rioters and looters. So the question of who controls what, who's fringe and who's central, is really the question of it. So, like, on one narrative, the protesters out there are the real example, and there are a couple bad apples. In another narrative, what happens is a whole bunch of people are being paid to go out there to serve as camouflage for the people who are really there to destroy the thing. What's true? Well, what do you believe? Anyways, but these people have been gathering a disproportionate amount of media attention. Adding to the irony, many of the conservative commentators who have thrown their support behind the police in recent days would be the first to condemn governments in Venezuela, Iran, or China to call for swift regime change for less. And that's true. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo brilliantly demonstrated the fraud at the core of American exceptionalism ideology on Tuesday when he had the audacity to criticize China for denying protesters in Hong Kong a voice while U.S. police forces continue to run roughshod over the Constitution for the entire world to witness. And I think that's interesting that China's suppressing its people and calling out America for what we're doing. America's suppressing its people and calling out China for what they're doing. So what do you learn? There's a lot of hypocrisy in the world. And you can see it. And I'm telling the story this way. I'm not telling you the narrative you want to hear where you get to have a good guy and a bad guy. I'm showing you this is a mess where people are making stuff up left and right to tell stories, and you're given a narrative to lead you to an outcome, whereas the reality is this is a mess that could go any direction, including ones we are not considering, third-way solutions that I'm trying to articulate and trying to figure out, frankly. It's not that I just know them. We have to figure these out together. It isn't Tom telling you what to do. It's all of us in this open source intelligence community, this strange island of sanity, finding a way out of this mess. And coming into it honestly. You got to come in and admit your biases up front. Always got to do that. There is no such thing as objectivity. It's the biggest load of crap, and it's a lie that gets a lot of people hurt. A particularly disturbing video, supposedly recorded in Compton on Tuesday night, shows 3 police officers beating the crap out of a man behind a wall, with one placing his knee on the man's neck, the same tactic that has led to George Floyd's tragic death. And I will tell you one thing, and this is across all things, the fact that there's video out there of everything, it makes this so much worse. Because you can find, I could show you 10 different videos of people wrecking and destroying stuff, and I could show you 10 different videos of police brutality, and one side sees the 10 of one, and one side sees the other, and they get so mad, and so angry, and so hurt, and they're like, you know what, I have no choice but to fight. And that's what we're being led to. We're being led into a fight, and realize these are not accidents. Why is this happening? That's the question we need to be asking. Recall, it was only weeks ago that protests against temporary measures to curb the spread of COVID drew hundreds of angry right-wing demonstrators, some heavily armed, to the Michigan state capitol. One can only imagine the police reaction if hundreds of gun-toting black men showed up at the state capitol with threatening signs demanding, "Let us in, let us in." For these anti-tyranny activists, it appears that being asked nicely to wear a protective face mask and refrain from going shopping for a few weeks is a dictatorship. But the denial of basic First Amendment rights is just dandy. This hypocrisy naturally leaves many on the left to assume that conservatives supporting this violent police crackdown will have no problem with government tyranny whatsoever as long as it serves them and the status quo that directly benefits them. And let me just say real fast, I think that's actually true. I think people on the right would absolutely support that. And I'll tell you, it's a comment I've probably shared once or twice in the show before, but it's something I find really telling, and it's a great data point, is that in 2017, a majority of Democrats would have gladly supported Obama for a third term despite the constitutional provisions. And Republicans have said the same thing about Trump. So what does that mean? We don't believe in the law. We accept it as a status quo that we have to deal with. We fundamentally want control. And this is what happens when you have divergent narratives. We want to get back to a story we can believe in, and we will fight to do so. And this is why, people say the lie you're told in history is, oh, there's systemic injustices, and there's praxis, and there's all this, and it's not that. What it is it's this. People with will, faith, and desire go out there and do what they must to reshape the world. And if your will is strong enough, the world will bend itself to you. That's how history actually happens. And the will of people expressed as a group in support of an idea is the most powerful force in history. It absolutely is. And it will use and employ force or not use force as is appropriate. But all of these things are secondary to the question of what we choose to articulate and visualize as our future. And that's really what it comes down to. Because as we see, everyone is a hypocrite, Leftists who go around arguing for small government and states' rights and guns, and rightists arguing for how the national government needs to suppress people. Understand that we have been maneuvered into an ideological war of us versus them, and it's complicated, right? What are the two sides of this battle, which we can't seem to escape? One side is the side that kind of says the old way is better, responsibility, the old identity, let's put it back together. And the other side says, no, we need to do things new, it was bad, we need to do it different. And it's ultimately a question of if we're going to fight over that, and eventually, I don't know how you pull these together, because you saw in that first piece that I shared by, or I should say the second piece technically, let me get the guy's name because I want to give him credit here, by Ted Anthony, that we were stuck in a position where we have these divergent stories. So when you have, and I'm continuing this here, military helicopters, this is the Russia Today piece, military helicopters dispersing protesters in the streets of D.C., loudspeakers ominously warning citizens of an impending curfew, riot police lined up and armed to the teeth facing down demonstrators like state-controlled robots. These are scenes straight out of a dystopian novel. The moment has arrived for Americans to choose. They are either against government tyranny and willing to stand up, or speak loudly when they witness inaction, or they condone it. It's time to pick a side. But that's the problem, right? If you, and I will tell you, and this is true, you can believe it, they're saying it. The people in these streets right now are angry about the oppression, but if they became the state, and there's a long history of this, with a death toll well into the 9 figures, they would be even worse in a lot of ways than even Trump is. And I know people don't believe that, but there's never, as they always say on the left, communism's never been tried before. But every time it's been tried, they killed everyone who disagreed with them. Happened with Stalin, happened with Mao. Had he stayed in there, Lenin would have, Pol Pot, name the people. It doesn't matter. You can go into, there were plenty of people in Cuba, too. There's not, and the right did it, too. I mean, Hitler killed people, and nationalism has these sort of things, and that's why we had limited government, and we tried to limit things. And monarchies were a much nicer form of government. Mass mobilization and nationalization, where the need to have people work together, has made the state the industry of death dealing. Not just to its people, but not just to people against it, but within their country. I remember reading a few years back this incredible statistic that 10 times the amount of people have been killed by the state within their countries than have been killed between states in warfare. So if you want to know what the biggest threat to you, it always is your state. But fundamentally, the idea that you allow revolutionaries who go out there promising to force equality, well, that's the French Revolution all again. And you did remove the existing power structures when that happened. And it's a really useful way if you want to kill a lot of people quick in the names of injustice, and you want to get rid of the people who oppose the state in favor of this radicalized revolution. But fundamentally, it usually makes things worse, and it usually ends up with a really even worse tyrant afterward. The French Revolution led to Napoleon. The German Socialist Weimar Republic led to Hitler. So you're going to have these things happen, and why? Because people will demand order and authority and the reimposition of some sort of structure. That's what people want. We want stability, and these people are offering complete instability. And that's fundamentally why even when they win, they lose in the end, because eventually people get sick of the idea that they're constantly in revolution. Even China went around, and now they basically are nationalism. China's kind of like nationalist fascist, masquerading as communist. But this is the world we live in, so, it's what we're dealing with. So that's how the left kind of sees the thing. And let's be honest about it, right? So that the argument that the right is being utterly hypocritical about social unrest and the use of violence is absolutely true. It is absolutely true, but they're doing so in their self-interest, and that the left is going out there saying they support freedom and all these things, and freedom of speech, that's true. But how many people on Twitter in 5 seconds say, you need to have your account shut down, you said something that offended me. So everyone's a hypocrite, everyone's a liar, everyone's a piece of crap. In the Bible it says people have the morality of filthy rags. And it is true, because we're always constantly as scared little animals with our reptile brains running around thinking how we can save ourselves. And that's what we do. And so can we lift ourselves up to something higher? That's why I put truth at the center of this. It's what this show is about. It's what my personal ideology is about. And look, I have to struggle not to be my rat brain self, and a lot of times it goes out and wants to pick fights on these issues, because honestly, I look at certain groups, I'm like, you know what, I should just work with my in-group, the hell with it, we're going to be targeted, I know we're going to be the bad guys, I've been a thought criminal, it's not long before I go to jail for re-education, and I'll fight. And I will tell you, if there was a radical revolution of a certain band, I would fight to the death for it, and I'd probably die, but at least I'd be, lionized as a martyr. I guess it's something, and, I'd go to heaven, hopefully, or, we'll see what happens, but those are the sort of things we deal with, and I want you to see what the other side of it looks like. So that's sort of left-wing universe side, what it looks like. So here's the right-wing side of it. This piece is from the Washington Times, published by Bill Gertz, June 3rd. Exclusive, Antifa planned anti-government insurgency for months, law enforcement official says. And these pieces, depending on your own ideological background, may offend you in either direction. My point is, I want you to hear what the other side's saying, right? And I want you to understand they are living in a different universe than you. So when you don't know why people draw different conclusions, now you'll understand. Activists of the far-left Antifa movement began planning to foment a nationwide anti-government insurgency as early as November as the U.S. presidential campaign kicked off in earnest, according to a law enforcement official with access to intelligence behind the shadowy group. The radical movement has emerged as a key focus for investigators in the wake of violent protests and looting across the country after the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis, according to U.S. law enforcement officials and private security experts. The law enforcement official would not speak on the record about Antifa's plans as the election season heats up, but longtime analysts of the group say such a move would be entirely in character. Antifa's actions represent a hard break with the long tradition of peaceful political process in the United States, said former National Security Council staff member Rich Higgins. Their Marxist ideology seeks not only to influence elections in the short term, but to destroy the use of elections as the determining factor in political legitimacy. So let's pull this out. So from the right-wing perspective, you read a bunch of pieces from the left where they said, that Obama's work was undone by Trump, all right? From the right-wing's perspective, the election of Trump was completely delegitimized by the utter decisions by the left to not stand down. And one of the things people on the left really don't understand about why the right is so pissed off is people on the right saw Obama as an existential threat who was destroying things they thought were key elements of how this country should function. And so, but they took it the other way because they said, okay, well, it's an election. My sense of fair play obliges me to go ahead and admit we're going to be okay with this. And one of the angry things is that Trump was never even given a chance. And from the Pussy Hat March, whatever stupidity that was, from the very beginning of this to everything on there, what do you have seen? And what you see over and over again is whenever a Republican gets elected, whenever it happens, going back, you go to Nixon, Ford, Reagan. It didn't happen as much with Bush the older, but Bush the younger. They're idiots. They're heartless. They're cruel. And the media tells a story. And the media telling the story one way is something to happen. And why did that lead to the creation of first talk radio, then Fox News, then all these other entities like the Examiners and the Washington Times? These papers are mouthpieces for the Republican Party. I have no doubt about it. But the New York Times is a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party, too. Don't kid yourself. They don't attack them other than when they absolutely have to. And what you have is you have mass propagandizing of the American population by corporate media to put us at war with one another. And I just want you to see both sides of it that are being out there. And then look, I think people genuinely believe that. I'm not blaming it. But if we're going to talk about systemic institutional problems, let's be honest. Let's say the media, democracy puts two sides at war with each other indefinitely. That's what our government does. That money makes us treat everyone as transactional, right? That the media makes us all hate one another constantly in the search for more money, more ratings, and more support to help the same corporations that support these sort of actions and fund them to make things worse. So, you have virtuous cycles in life, but this is a vicious cycle. And you can see it, and you can see how angry they are, and that you see the language of dehumanization that's being employed in both directions, because you can't just say one side is always to blame and one side's always right before the other side says, okay, you're going to target us, we're going to target you. And that's where we are in the United States. So if you want to say that if you say X group is responsible for something, you have just made an enemy of yourself. So if you want to talk about systems, I'm fine with that, but let's attack systems. Let's not attack people. Can you do that? You think you can. It's really hard. I struggle with it more than almost anyone out there, even because you say things that are true that upset people, and then what do? We form up in tribes and clans and we fight one another. And I don't know if you can escape that. That's how we are hardwired. Fighting biology is a really hard thing to do. That's why I talk about spirit and faith and stuff, because you're trying to become a different sort of person than, our biology would demand. Because if I was just taking a biological approach, we should form into tribes, fight one another, and the strongest ones should subjugate the weakers. That's what most of human history is. And that's where we're receding to. And that's what happens when a nation's culture is destroyed. Counterculture did that, and it breaks apart. Okay, let's see where we were here. Added Joe Myers, former Defense Intelligence Agency official and counterinsurgency expert, President Trump's election and revitalization of America are a threat to Antifa's nihilist goals. They are fomenting this violence to create havoc, despair, and target the Trump campaign for defeat in 2020. More generally, senior Trump administration officials and private analysts are warning the radicals have rushed to exploit recent anti-police protests to set into motion a program of widespread civil unrest, a program that involves using the protests for looting and burning inner cities with the help of criminals and street gangs. So what would be the logic? Let's be fair here. What would be the logic by which you would burn down your own city? Well, if you wanted to make people angry in a given area, if you destroy their city, you would make them angry. So what do they do? The protesters, the leading edge, the radical flank of this, what are they doing? They're committing a form of political warfare where they're deliberately destroying these cities for both international sympathy, the propaganda purposes, for destabilizing the legitimacy of a regime that depends upon the use of law and order, and threatening them to try to use overwhelming force, which is what, in fact, the right wing very, very, very much wants and will support when it comes, and it is coming. But they also do so because they want to make anger greater in the areas they're at. They want the frustration to build to a crescendo, because if they can shake the system enough, it falls apart. And that's what you do if you're a revolutionary. You figure out where the weak points are in the system, and whether you're Chinese operatives, globalist spies, or just a radical revolutionary who spent too much time reading Marx in college, you end up with the same sort of background. And it works in both directions. The right does the same thing, just in different ways. I want you to understand this, because you need to understand what you're seeing. You tell the story one way, but the reality of what's happening, if you consider the facts and purposes of why people do things that don't make sense, if someone's doing something that doesn't make sense, you don't understand why they're doing it. Think more deeply. Take a breath and figure it out, and take a step back for a little bit. And you got to take steps back. You got to look away from the narrative. Get away from the narrative and analyze the points of the argument, okay? So, far from a centrally organized... Okay, so let's see. A program that involves using the protests of looting and burning inner cities with the help of criminals and street gangs. And a lot of corporate money. Don't kid yourself. Corporations are sending money, and they present it as virtue signaling for we support blacks. They didn't... Look, all these people who are putting all these money into these protests, okay, I'll be honest with you, all these celebrities, these A-list people, right? They put $200,000 into a bail fund. Where were they for helping black people when things were bad and there wasn't protests? They weren't there, so why are they doing it now? Because they've suddenly come to light? They're doing it for two reasons. Some of them are doing it because they want to get social brownie points. There's no doubt about that. And Lord knows Twitter is a toxic echo chamber. I don't know why I'm on there. But actually I do know why, because I want to go ahead and present how stupid it is. But ultimately, the other thing you have out there beyond that is that it is going ahead and building this up more, because people understand that this is going to have an incredibly destructive capacity that some people find very useful, okay? Like, say you're a big business. Say you're Amazon, for instance. Every small mom and pop business gets shut down. Everyone's scared to go outside. Hey, Amazon Prime, here's the solution. Problem, reaction, solution. It's the way you control people if you run a government. You create a problem, you control it to go certain ways, and you have a solution already ready where you know, oh, it's a miracle, it's here. Here's the vaccine that you've been waiting for. Here's the solution. You don't have to take risks. And what has the solution been? That fewer people are concentrating more power, whether it be in government, whether it be in economics, and they have greater control over you. Don't believe me? How high was the stock market? Keep an eye on that. How much is the Fed own now? Keep an eye on that. You're not talking about that. Why? Because you're fighting for justice. And meanwhile, you're fighting for justice while you're being robbed blind. You're out there protesting in the street, and they're robbing your house with, everything you have. You're robbing your wallet from your very pocket. You don't even care. I mean, it's crazy. You can see how I lose my mind talking about this stuff. It's just because I know things, but people don't know them. This is the real world. It's ugly. It's awful. It's brutal. I don't know how you guys listen to this show. It's miserable, but it's true. So maybe it's useful. I don't know. Lord knows. I just want to talk about theology. That makes me happy. Okay, so let's see what else we got here. In recent days, the group interspersed its operatives among protests set off by the police killing of a handcuffed Mr. Floyd. Mr. Trump singled out Antifa for the violent protests. The president said Monday, in recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. White House National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said U.S. officials are pressing for more intelligence on the group's activities in light of the events of recent days. And this is going to be the next fight, by the way, is they're going to say they're not an organization, and the government's going to start arresting them, and we're going to have a long argument where people are going to disagree, and people on the left are going to experience what people on the far right have for long times, having your government treat you as a terrorist. It's not fun. Believe me, I've had the joy of that. Just for talking. The president and the attorney general want to know from FBI defector Christopher Wray what the FBI has been doing to track and surveil and prosecute Antifa, Mr. O'Brien said. If that hasn't been happening, we want to know what the plan is going forward. And I will tell you, the fact that the deep state sees this differently than the administration is going to be a fight. Expect a lot of firings and efforts to do things. I've heard from some good sources that they're going to make another attempt at impeachment. So this is going to make it worse. And that's fine, because ultimately worse is better for the idea if you want to take down America. And that's where we're going for reasons that we don't fully understand. I could speculate a lot of it has to do with it's easier to put a global system in place if you remove the old system first. Mr. Myers argued that Antifa clearly meets the criteria for being labeled a terrorist and insurgent movement. It is employing organized violence for political ends, destruction of the constitutional order, he said. All right, and then it goes into direct action. What makes the shadowy group unique in its willingness is to use the use of violence. What Antifa organizers and sympathizers call direct action in support of the anarchist and Marxist-Leninist agenda. That often involves setting fires, looting, throwing bricks and bottles at police, and in one case, the apparent use of a milkshake laced with quick dry cement and attacking opponent in the face. And this was done, and I will tell you, these things were celebrated. I know people who were attacked by things like this say, oh, but they're bad people. They were bad people for arguing for the rights of their people, which if any other group did except one group, I'll tell you the truth, in America, this is true, there are 4 groups that can be attacked for anything. White people, heterosexual, Christians, and rural folk. And if you want to know why I'm such a miserable bastard, it happens that I fall into every one of those categories. For instance, the same people who would say it's ignorant to go ahead and call people by some name have no shortage of redneck hillbilly jokes. So we're all hypocrites. And look, to be very clear, people on our side make all sorts of horrible, racially epithet-laced jokes. We can all laugh at them all. We can be mad about them all, but you need to just recognize these things happen, okay? Antifa was originally focused in West Coast cities such as Portland, Oregon, and Berkeley, California. Antifa supporters later took part in demonstrations during the inauguration of Mr. Trump in January 2017. However, security officials said the coordinated national-level riots inspired by Antifa in recent days are unprecedented. In New York, a senior police official provided the first details of how radical anarchists like those with Antifa came from outside the city and intentionally incited protesters to violence. And so, as you're listening to this, doesn't this sound like a very different story? One story is noble protesters standing against the man. The other one is of an organized mob being sent in to destroy things. Which one do you want to believe? Well, what if they're both true? Isn't that harder to deal with? Okay, John Miller, Deputy Police Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism, told NBC New York that the radicals' operations included organized scouts, medical teams, and an arsenal of rocks, bottles, and accelerants. The material was used by hardcore activists interspersed among the protesters who would break away from the larger demonstrations to commit acts of violence and vandalism. And so what happens here? So some people would say, well, that's the protesters getting madder. But on the other hand, there's another argument that goes that why didn't the police department shut these things down when they were bigger or when they were smaller? Well, could it be that, you see all these protests and people on the right are commenting on this constantly. It's in democratic towns and democratic states with democratic mayors who are not putting the police out there. And you hear story, and you can find them on the internet. You don't have to look harder. Story of police officers saying we're being forced to stand down. Minneapolis' city council actually said that they are looking to get rid of the police altogether. What does a world without police look like? Well, whoever controls the violence in the streets runs it. And why would they go ahead and support that? I don't know. Does it fit an agenda? I guarantee you a lot of people on the right think so. If you're on the left, do you think so? Do you think a world without police is safer? Do you feel comfortable having the people in the streets to have direct imposition of justice and redistribution now? You better think carefully about what these things are out there. These are the things we're walking into. And not only were those walked into in France, but this is exactly how the Bolsheviks took control. They had radical things in Russia, in St. Petersburg, which later became Leningrad before it became St. Petersburg again, and Moscow, where they actually did this, and they were able to take authority. And they said, okay, we were going to have a provisional election, and that was the May Revolution, the May Day one. And before that could happen in November, where the moderates were going to win, the people who were direct radicals took control directly and seized the means of production. And that's what they celebrate. That's what they think is right. So and I will say, so between the left and the right, one thing you got to realize, and this is a part of the story I don't think you escape, is that the days of democracy are done. Democracy didn't work because it set us against one another so well that there's going to be a new authority in town. Will it be left-leaning? Will it be right-leaning? Will it be a collapse? We don't know. But ultimately, nobody is happy with democracy. It's a false idol, and you shouldn't be afraid to shatter it. I haven't been. It took a long time because people attack you for attacking conventional wisdom. But if conventional wisdom is demonstrably wrong, you need to be able to adapt quickly. And as we look at these sort of things, we see the conventional wisdom on either side of this is a little simplistic. There are legitimate grievances that are being co-opted, and conversely, there are people using them for wrong ends. And what we should figure out is who are the motive actors who are pushing this. That's how you really get to the point of who we should be talking about, my opinion. Which doesn't take away the legitimate issues we can talk about between people who want peace, security, law, and order, and those who want justice, safety, and a fair shake. Those are not values that should be at contrast with one another. That we've created a system where they are is a sign that our system is broken and needs massive change. And politics isn't going to do it because, let's be honest, that thing is bought and paid 400 times over. And if you still believe that makes a difference, I don't know what to tell you, man. I mean, you've seen it. You just look at your own evidence. Did you ever get what you wanted? You get the lesser of two evils if you're happy. All right, what else do we got here? Mr. Miller, who did not mention Antifa by name, says he has high confidence in the intelligence assessment of the activities. They included strong indicators that the violent protesters had made preparations. Antifa also used encrypted communications as part of the planning. Before the protest began, organizers of certain anarchist groups set out to raise bail money, and people who would be responsible to be raising bail money. They set out to recruit medics, and medical teams were geared to deploy in anticipation of violent interactions with police, Mr. Miller said. Doesn't sound very spontaneous to me. They prepared to commit property damage and directed people who were following them that this should be done selectively and only in wealthier areas or at high-end stores run by corporate entities, he added. Why? Because people don't feel bad when Starbucks gets torched, whereas they feel bad when Joe's Coffee Shop does. A New York City police spokeswoman confirmed Mr. Miller's information, said the operations of the rioters included a complex network of scouts on bicycles who would move ahead of demonstrators and identify locations with minimal police presence. At those locations, extremists were easily able to vandalize or burn vehicles using Molotov cocktails. And doesn't this sound different than what you're hearing, right? I mean, when you get into the operational details, you realize it isn't a spontaneous expression of anger. It's a revolutionary moment. And I have no problem with them saying they want a revolution or even trying to enact it in theory, but be honest about it. And that's what they do. They lie over and over and over and over again. And they co-opt, and they're lying now about what their intentions are. How much more lies do you think will follow if they're willing to go this far to go ahead and use the death of a man who was innocently killed by the police to advance their agenda? What won't they use? And that's been the problem, honestly, with the radical Marxist left for many years. They will do absolutely anything to create their utopia. They have a dream. They believe they are as much believers in their own faith as I am in Christ as our Lord and Savior. But the difference is they believe that man can create heaven on earth, and if man can't go there, the only thing is you need to fix man. That's usually the root of all evil. It's when you think your good precludes other people's right to have their own beliefs. And, it's a hard thing. I get it. But, you have to allow that. People have to have choice. Otherwise, without liberty, all you have is suppression. We become animals. And that's what we're seeing. People act like animals, destroying, breaking everything. Antifa's leftist agenda calls for supporting so-called social justice movements. Among the liberal left causes espoused by the groups are issues of racism and police misconduct, support for Muslim minorities, and backing the transgender rights movement. Attorney General William P. Barr said peaceful and legitimate protests against Mr. Floyd's death were, quote, hijacked by violent radical elements, end quote. He singled out Antifa for special criticism. Groups outside of radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate, violent, and extremist agenda, Mr. Barr said on Sunday. FBI counterterrorism officials have been monitoring Antifa and similar violent groups for years. In a bid to obscure its actions, Antifa has begun using cover names such as Black Lives Matter, Smash Racism, Abolish ICE, and others. And I will say one of the other things that the media does, because the media often has a lot of friends in there, and you saw this in the hit pieces that were written about me when I was just talking about coronavirus. What do they end up doing is they end up creating boogeymen to make it say there's equivalency. There's far left and there's far right. There's extremists at all times. I will tell you, every far-right group in America doesn't have an equivalent of one donation of what one of these groups got. And I know them very, very well. Trust me. So I'm just telling you that this is a false equivalency. It's out there, which doesn't mean there aren't people who believe the ideology, but they can't do anything. And so the state allows one and not the other. And so why does the state allow one to exist? You need to understand that, right? And that's part of this story, because it's not like we live in a total free... If we lived in a total free-for-all where the state had lost control, you would have far-right movements marching to fight this. That's what happened in Germany in the 1920s and why things went the way they did ultimately. They were called the Freikorps, and long before the Nazis, soldiers that were coming back from the war went to suppress things that were happening because they were unhappy about it. And it's not a question of who was right and who was wrong. Legitimacy is always in the eye of the beholder. But that's what happens. But right now we have a government and corporate structure enabling a certain sort of revolution. Why and to what end? Who benefits? Cui bono? All right, the communist roots. The name Antifa is derived from the Moscow-based Communist International in 1933 that directed the Soviet-led Communist Party, USA, to form the American League Against War and Fascism. That group was patterned after Germany's Anti-Fascist Action, or Antifa, formed in 1932. Antifasciste. That's what they're called. So this is a very old international group caught up in the Soviet movement from the Soviet Union. CPUSA leader Manning Johnson testified in Congress in 1953 the goal of the Front Group was never the abolishment of fascism, but rather the subversion and subsequent overthrow of the United States. The National Security Council's Mr. O'Brien described Antifa foot soldiers as militant radicals who come into our cities and cross state lines. They're organized and use Molotov cocktails and fireworks and gas to burn down our cities, especially businesses in minority neighborhoods. It's got to be stopped, he said. Mr. Higgins, former NSC staffer, sees Antifa as a significant tool of leftist and communist political warfare. Antifa's goal is nothing less than fomenting revolution, civil war, and silencing America's anti-communists, said Mr. Higgins, a former Pentagon irregular warfare expert. Their labeling of Trump supporters and patriots as Nazis and racists is standard fare for left-wing communist groups. So when you hear about the alt-right being terrible and the media doing that, what are you learning? Well, you're learning that this was a brand that was put on us, that was out there. And the story that actually happened was far more complex. And there were a lot of people in there that were given a say, and they would literally somehow say horrible things and never get persecuted because they present the vision of what a false enemy looks like. That's what you have to understand. The ideology of Antifa at its center is Marxist-Leninism, he said. Antifa is currently functioning as the command and control of the riots, which are themselves the overt utilization of targeted violence against targets to stores, capitalism, monuments, histories, churches, God, he said. Until the riots, the FBI paid little attention to left-wing radical groups and other subversive organizations because of the overwhelming focus of people and investigative resources on the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda terrorist groups. Social media sites such as Facebook say they have taken down some provocative posts by right-wing groups posing as Antifa members. Additionally, the Bureau has put much heavier emphasis on investigating right-wing extremists, even though these groups are smaller than those like Antifa, Mr. Higgins says. And why does that happen? You have to look at John Brennan, who was actually the former head of the CIA, who was a member of the Communist Party. You can find all this stuff. It's just a matter if you want to look for the facts and how you want to put it together. So you need to be aware that this is what this group is about, and but the part they don't cover here, and this is the part that's even deeper, is who funds Antifa? Who funds all these social justice organizations? What's the very corporations that are going to burn down will have all this money? There's a direct line between the colleges and the universities that teach these ideologies and the big endowments that come from corporations and banks and big money. So big money's on board with the radical revolutionaries who say they're against capitalism. So what gives? If you have big money against capitalism, what are they trying to do? They're trying to leverage their power into making it a system where they can have direct authority and not have to have the unpleasant intermediary of using money as a tool. And I want to give credit to the left for one thing. One thing the left does 1,000 times better than the right, and I tell people all the time, is that they understand money's a tool and they don't become in love with it. The right becomes so idolatrous of money that they think that's the only way to measure things, because there's two parts to it. Number one is greed, and that's an ugly key motive. But the second part of it is an obsession with the idea of having metrics to measure fairness. The world is not fair. Realists will tell you fairness went out the window, and this idea that you're going to make everything equal. But since they're so sensitive to this argument, there's inequality, you see everyone on the right spend hours going ahead and arguing statistics and numbers. And I could do it all day long with you, but I don't, because as Mark Twain once said, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. I could give you an argument that would present 6 different sides by showing you the facts how you want, but it's the narrative that's important, because it comes to the question of what you as a thinking individual will choose for your future. And I want you to see what choices you're being presented. The choice you're being presented by the right is an imposition of a national regime where a force is imposed to remove people who are going out there representing a violent threat to you. And I will say to people who think that their spot in life is likely to get worse rather than better, and there's a lot of people who frankly would see that, who understand what is done in history when communism has been put in an authority for the benefit of few at the expense of a lot, what they call the dictatorship of the proletariat, that sort of elite that never has the same rules apply. In the Politburo, that is the thing they're fighting against. And, we see it in China today. That exists. And they're very wealthy, except for the billions of people who are poor. But hey, it has an ideology and it's willing to use force to put out there, and they keep people at the edge of desperation, like our system has done for a long time, because that's how you can control people. If people have a chance to think too much, like the Washington Post article says, that's when revolution happens. And we've kind of been allowed to walk an interesting path. Anyway, skepticism. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham, South Carolina Republican, said he is skeptical about the prominence of Antifa's role in the recent unrest despite the administration's concerns. We will try to find out how organized this violence is, Mr. Graham said, but I'm old enough to remember 1968, and Antifa was not around in 1968 that I know of. Antifa was big in Europe, if you want to know the history of it. You really got to look at this, because a lot of what happened is the nationalism fights that have come into American politics really have a lot of roots in Europe, on both sides, by the way. Antifa also gets support from some academics. Walter F. Heinecke, University of Virginia Associate Professor of Education, helped secure permits for counter-protests that included Antifa and other groups in 2017 against the Unite the Right political rally for white nationalists, although Mr. Heinecke asserted he did not knowingly back the anarchist group's participation. And by the way, in case you don't know what they were actually marching for, and I've met Jason Kessler, the guy who organized that. I've sat and talked to him. The Unite the Right rally was designed to protest the removal of statues, talking to history, in Charlottesville, Virginia, and that's what that was about. And then it ended up getting expanded, and you know how these things go in politics. And ultimately, even if you really should actually get to know the true history of Charlottesville, because if you don't, none of it will make sense. And what happened is you had 300 guys marching around, and you had basically thousands of people around them, and they were funneled into a single spot where they were accused of having all this terrible violence. And one guy who was getting literally, his car was getting assaulted with bats, tried to escape out of there, and a girl took a heart attack. That's the story of it. It was the world's worst terrorist episode. You have more violence than that on a Friday night in Chicago, but they don't tell you that story because they want to have a boogeyman. And they basically were able to destroy what was the beginning of a movement to offer a right-wing sort of resistance. And the right wing is never allowed to organize because the FBI doesn't want it to happen. And why doesn't the FBI want it to happen? Because there's a lot of people within the FBI who basically espouse, within government, radical revolutionary tendencies. And that's been the way for a very long time. That's just the way it is. And I'm not saying every foot soldier is bad, but that's the way Washington thinks. That's their big government, and they think big government. Okay, so let's continue here. Asked whether he supports the movement, Mr. Heinecke said, I am against fascism, so if Antifa means against fascism, then generally, yes. Mr. Heinecke emphasized he is not technically a member of an Antifa organizing group, and I don't speak for any Antifa organization. And that's the thing. Have you noticed that these organizations have these big changes? Like, remember, Anonymous is another example. They're coming back around. Antifa. Nobody's a member of the organization, but they're out there. Why do they do this? This is public relations theory. They do it. That's how you set guerrilla cells. You go ahead. It's the same thing you saw with ISIS. Really familiar, isn't it? And it's tactical. I mean, actually, Antifa goes over, and some of their hardest core people go train with the Syrian Free Army. It's you can go look that up. It's out there. I like to think all Americans are against fascism, and if so, they're anti-fascist, he said. So we name our group something. So if I name myself the American Freedom League, all of a sudden, everyone who's against me is against freedom, and you see how this happens. Mr. Heinecke said Mr. Trump and Mr. Barr have made no mention of white nationalists taking action against the black church. We don't hear the equivalent cries from Trump and Barr about extreme right-wing agitators trying to turn this into a race war, he said. And just because you don't see it. I mean, there's a couple people, but even Adam Waffen, the one you hear about, is really a CIA creation. I talked to the guy, supposedly he was responsible for creating that. He said he didn't even have anything to do with it. There's all this stuff out there. It's really weird. And you see these big, horrible organizations that are out there, but there's never any people on them. They're made up. And including to some extent, but you have to look who has the ability to act is real and who's talked about but doesn't have the ability to act isn't. Because if they could, they would. They're opportunistically looking for Antifa as the boogeyman to deflect the real issue. There's an insurrection going on in this country against the racist culture and structure. Harvard Divinity School professor Cornel West has praised Antifa for protecting him and other protesters in Charlottesville in 2017. Antifa and its supporters call its operating methods direct action. Mark Bray, author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, argues that militant anti-fascism is a reasonable response to what he sees as the rise of right-wing politics. It is an unabashedly partisan call to arms to equip a new generation of anti-fascists with the history and theory necessary to defeat the resurgent far right, Mr. Bray said. And if you want, you go find that book by Mr. Bray. You will see that it argues all sorts of the political uses of violence used for the advancement of the revolution. It's very clear about it. They count on you not reading it. The press never covers it. This stuff is out there. It's not a secret. And it's not unpopular. It's the edgy thing to do where every kid wants to be Che Guevara on a campus because that's what the social signaling supports. Andy No, a journalist who was beaten by Antifa activists last year, has closely monitored the activities of the group. He recently wrote that riots around the country are glimmers of the full insurrection the far left has been working toward for decades. Mobilization and disinformation. The death of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis was a pretext for launching the Antifa insurgency, he said. In a matter of hours after the video of Floyd began circulating the internet, militant Antifa cells across the country mobilized to Minnesota to aid Black Lives Matter rioters, he said. Mr. No said Antifa supporters have spread disinformation as white supremacists and nationalists who are to blame for the rioting. So far, no evidence has emerged linking white right-wing extremists to the violence. And I'll just tell you, if you want to see where white nationalists hang out, go to 4chan.org/poll, and they're saying there, we're not going to go, and they're not going to fight for things that are out there, but are going to only help a system that hates us. Everyone's sitting back just watching and defending their own thing. Why? Because the police have spent years going after anything right of center. I mean, they basically have called Christians Nazis, and they're not. They're just not. I mean, and look, I understand National Socialism. I've studied it in immense depth. Frankly, there is nothing in this country that's even near that level of state power continuity. It just doesn't exist. It doesn't fit the model that exists in this time. Antifa has been operating relatively unimpeded by law enforcement in recent years, despite its use of violence, and many analysts credit the movement's support and sympathy from the liberal left of the American political and media establishment. One reason is that so many Democratic leaders have children and family members that are active participants in the Marxist movement, with many of them being leading members of Antifa, insofar as one can be a member, said Mr. Higgins, a former national security official. Jeremiah Ellison, son of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, tweeted his support for Antifa on Sunday. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio had his daughter arrested in New York with protesters, and Senator Tim Kaine's son Woody was also affiliated with Antifa, Mr. Higgins said. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, California Democrat, condemned Antifa after its activists sparked riots in Berkeley several years ago. But in a now-deleted 2018 tweet, Mr. Ellison, then deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee, posted a photograph of an Antifa handbook with the statement that the manual should strike fear in the heart of, quote, of @real Donald Trump. Asked about the tweet on Sunday, Mr. Ellison told reporters that the tweet about Antifa was meaningless. It means nothing. Look, I was at a bookstore and saw a book. Say, Mr. Ellison, it means nothing. Well, you have to decide if he chose to do that as an accident or if he was saying something. The FBI, which is in charge of countering domestic security threats posed by foreign intelligence services or domestic terrorists, has largely avoided focusing on Antifa. A search of the FBI website produces no results for Antifa. The FBI investigated 3 Antifa activists suspected of beating a Unite the Right protester in Charlottesville 3 years ago, but no charges were brought. In fact, I know the details of this case, and the evidence was confiscated by the FBI, and then it was lost. Funny how that happens. It's like Epstein, dying in the things. They don't find what they don't want to find. In the state, you have to conclude, whatever else you think, for whatever reason, the state is letting these protests happen. What that means, you can decide. Kenneth D. Graffenreid, who was Deputy National Counterintelligence Executive during the George W. Bush administration, said, the FBI has not been engaged in effective domestic counterintelligence for years. The FBI has not had a meaningful domestic counterintelligence capability for many years. Mr. Graffenreid said they've been distracted or politically corrupted. An FBI spokeswoman declined to comment. But you'll remember when the Obama administration was in there, they went to community policing and they changed the way they did everything. What's community policing? That's what they're talking about here. And so what we've seen is that law does not exist as an entity unto itself. It is a tool of the state used in political oppression by one side against the other, or some side seeking advantage. If you understand the law that way, you will be much better off. There are certain laws we agree to sort of adhere to, and we hold up as sort of a national 10 commandments, like the Bill of Rights. But fundamentally, we ignore every other law. We have selective prosecution. We have some people who commit murder who get off because they look a certain way. We have other people who go to jail for many, many years for making one dumb comment on the internet. I've been at the heart of those fights for many years. I can tell you they're absolutely true, and they have leaned a certain way. That is, this insurgency, in my observation, is being enabled. And let's keep in mind, the insurgency is something separate from the protest. You need to understand that if we're going to put this piece together. So I'm going to share this piece, and this piece caused a lot of controversy. It was written by Mike Adams, who runs Natural News. Some people think he's full of shit. Some people believe him. This is a piece that's out there, but I want to put it out there as reflective of what you see a lot of on the right wing. And they say, oh, this isn't legitimate because it hasn't been around forever and it's not well supported. But yet, I will tell you, people are worried about it, and there is chatter going around in a lot of different places that, in fact, you are seeing the efforts in the rioting in the cities to be taken out to rural and suburban areas, which is a major change, because then the people who've been sitting back watching this thinking it's not our problem may decide to engage, and then that's when the war gets hot. So you need to be aware of this risk. And I'll just share this is from Mike Adams over at Natural News, and it's gotten blocked from Facebook and other places because, quote unquote, it's not legitimate. But on the other hand, the blocking of a media source that has leaned a certain way, allowed certain people to talk to other people. Who is to determine what's legitimate? I argue it's you, the listener, so let's hear the story. This piece by Mike Irons, breaking: Antifa terrorists to be busted Sparta, Illinois, with orders to burn farmhouses and kill livestock in rural white areas. Today, Natural News has learned that Antifa operatives are organizing a plan to bust large numbers of Antifa terrorists to the vicinity of Sparta, Illinois, where they will be directed to target rural white Americans by burning farmhouses and killing livestock. The purpose of the attack, according to sources, is so that Antifa can send a message to white America that not even rural white safes are safe from the reach of Antifa, and if their radical left-wing demands are not met, all of America will burn, not just the cities. Sources tell Natural News that Antifa terrorists are currently expected to move along state routes 154 and 4, seeking out rural targets, including isolated homes and farms, to cause maximum mayhem and property destruction. Although our sources did not specify or specifically mention the methods by which killing livestock would be accomplished, it seems almost certain that firearms would be the most effective way for Antifa terrorists to achieve that morbid goal. And I'm just, like I said, now this is going to sound very harsh to some people, but this is how the other side sees it. And one of the reasons why we're going into this is I want you to see how you are perceived by others. If you lean right of center, I want you to see how you are the epitome of wickedness and oppression in an evil system. And if you're a leftist, I want people to understand you that you are virtual terrorists walking through the crowds, a threat to everyone. And that's the world we live in now. We don't live in the world of peace where we try to survive the virus because no one cared about the virus enough to do anything about it. We're just going to let it run through it so we can go back to fighting one another and going ahead and having it be terrorists versus revolutionaries and all this. This is the fight we're playing. But I want you to see it. And, this is just talking about tactics. Note, it is possible all Antifa may alter its planned routes of destruction based upon the appearance of this report. Although our sources are highly reliable individuals, the disinformation warfare tactics of Antifa are incredibly advanced, and part of the art of war is to make your enemy think you're in one place while you're actually attacking another. And I would mention that we talked about that as Chinese strategy as they're competing against the U.S. Who wants to see the U.S. fall? What groups are working against the U.S. interests? What groups are fighting things, and what kind of outcomes? We have all these conflicts on top of one another, and if you can't keep track of them all, I understand that. That's why people revert to ideology, because it's really hard to keep track of who's trying to screw who. It's like trying to describe the economy in terms of 20 different actors, rather than creating brief statistical models that miss outliers, the black swans that can change everything. We are told the timing of this attack is this coming weekend, which could indicate Friday, Saturday, or Sunday night. Today, we are urging the citizens of Sparta to prepare for the possibility of Antifa terrorism activities in their area. We are especially urging individuals who have houses located near the major highways to be on alert for attempted arson, property destruction, shootings, or the killing of livestock. About Sparta, Illinois. What else we got here? Sparta, Illinois is a small town of just 4,300 people according to the 2010 census. It is located in Randolph County and is roughly 45 miles southeast of St. Louis, the regional home of Ferguson, Missouri riots of 2014. Rural towns around Sparta include Blair, Tilden, Calderville, Baldwin, Cutler, Willisville, Bremen, and Chester. Illinois, dominated by anti-gun Democrats, is a state where citizens are not allowed to defend themselves with firearms. That is likely why Antifa is targeting Illinois for the kind of destruction that would be immediately halted by a barrage of return gunfire in states like Texas, Florida, or Tennessee. In Illinois, Antifa terrorists practically have their own shooting gallery of unarmed civilians who have been forcibly disarmed by the corrupt anti-Second Amendment politicians in Chicago. Although it's funny, they never seem to get back to the fact that there's a whole bunch of guns in Chicago owned illegally. And Chicago's getting really bad. I talked to a friend about the situation there. Literally, you basically have Latino versus black sort of race war brewing in the suburbs out there, and it's really kind of awful. The police are looking the other way. The whites don't want to touch anything, and the Latinos, to their credit or detriment, have stepped up to defend their communities as people have come in as rioters. By turning Illinois into a gun-free zone, Chicago lawmakers have transformed the state into a shooting gallery for Antifa terrorists. We encourage all law enforcement in Randolph County to be on high alert this coming weekend. This will not be your normal weekend of dragging overdosed, methed-up, heroin-addicted white boys to the emergency rooms in Chester and Waterloo. This is going to be something on an entirely different level if Antifa makes good on its current plans. Antifa has been labeled a terrorist organization by President Trump, and the actions of Antifa, property destruction, arson, looting, attempted murder of police officers, and extreme violence toward innocent people, reveals the terrorism goals of the radical left-wing organization. With this tactic moving into rural America, Antifa seems to be deciding that burning down left-wing cities isn't having the fear effect they hope to achieve. For many nights, Antifa groups have been threatening to fan out to the suburbs and start targeting white America. Now it seems they are planning to expand into rural America, at least in gun-free areas where the citizens can't shoot back. And then it says targeting infrastructure is the next escalation of Antifa terrorists. And so as we go through this, like I'm saying, some people would argue this could be disinformation too. And you're right, it could all be a load of crap. And yet we have to look what predictions are made, look what happens on the ground, and assess what accurately fits what's happening out there. And that's why we're going into all this. I want you to see what the threats and dangers are. Remember, the purpose of CV Central, whatever I'm going to call this in the end, is to keep you safe. That remains safe. And you need to realize this conflict is not what it appears to be. It's very violent, and there are bad actors. Some of them are the radical activists who are out there trying to cause a revolution. At least they're honest about it. And their corporate patrons behind them are the ones you should be even more worried about. The people who are paying to make this happen and not getting their hands dirty. There's a whole hell of a lot of that, and what they know that you don't know is the question we all need to be asking. Over the last 10 days, National News has learned from multiple intelligence sources that Antifa's next escalation will target U.S. infrastructure such as water, power, and telecommunications. Although not specifically mentioned by our sources in Illinois, we anticipate a very high probability that Antifa terrorists, if they carried out their planned mayhem in the rural areas surrounding Sparta, will likely target water towers with gunfire. Water towers can be very easily destroyed with gunfire, as bullet holes can often cause structural instability, leading to catastrophic collapse of the containment structure. Even when bullets don't achieve the total destruction of the tower, bullets are rapidly stopped by the water inside the tower, causing those bullets, usually made out of lead, to saturate the water with lead, a toxic heavy metal. This means that Antifa has a readily available means to poison the water supply of rural towns in Illinois and elsewhere while causing high repair costs for local infrastructure. And you could do the same thing, by the way, with the grid. You could shoot down transformers and take down half the country. As we have repeatedly warned in previous articles, much of America's infrastructure is shockingly vulnerable to bad faith actors and terrorists who are willing to cause mass poisonings, mayhem, and destruction in order to achieve their twisted political goals, which, in this case, are the rise of communism and the total genocide against whites, a goal that most of the big tech industry seems to openly support. And let's go a little further than that, right? I'm going to insert something. So China is in an asymmetric war against the United States. They have communist allies in the United States willing to destroy the country. They have a limitless pocketbook from China, if not from their own thing, to go do this. And remember, when the American Revolution happened, why did it happen? Because the French hated the British and they funded the colonists. And who went over there? None other than Benjamin Franklin, when him and Thomas Jefferson spent a lot of time in Paris convincing Louis XVI, maybe it was Louis XV then, to go ahead and provide a lot of support to the United States. And this same thing is happening now. This is how revolution happened and how countries fought wars for many years. We, in the 20th century, thought of countries lining up as unified entities against one another and fighting. But much warfare, and the Chinese history of warfare specifically, has been through subversion, has been through cultural decay and attack. And as we look at the fact that Antifa has been around since 1932, some of you have seen, and if you haven't seen it, it's brilliant. There's a video from a KGB defector, Yuri Bezmenov. It's from 1991 or so, talking about how they would win the war because they destroyed America from the inside out. As we look at this and you see people seeking to destroy their own country, what is happening? Because these people are not trying to build it up. They're trying to tear it down. It'd be one thing if this was a movement going saying, hey, we're going to go to the front and we're going to lead and we're going to change this way. But it didn't happen. And it's interesting because on the one hand, and this is the contradiction for my leftist friends, on the one hand, you had an evolutionary candidate in Bernie Sanders who was willing to do things in this way, move much more towards socialism, that big money, the same big money that's funding these protests, came down to destroy in favor of a corporate hack like Joe Biden, whose son was involved in heavy corruption in Ukraine and whose been bankrolled by the credit card industry forever out of Delaware. Okay? So if you look at these things and you really understand the different pieces that are in play in this, you begin to understand why is it all of a sudden the same people who wouldn't support an evolution toward this want violent unrest? Is it because they really want a progressive change, or is it because they want you to be the fall guys for the sort of thing that they're going to put in later? An authoritarian regime that will sound like it's egalitarian. In fact, it'll probably give everyone a UBI check, but it will give a situation where there will be a few people with a lot, everyone with a little, and a whole bunch of people. What they're doing is they're cutting the ladders to the castle and then throwing grain out to the plebs. This is how you build a new feudal society. That's what you're getting. You're not getting communism. You're getting a move back to something that's different. But that's okay. People don't understand that, and I know they're not going to. Maybe you guys will, and that's why I talk to you. So prepare to secure your farms, your homes, and your towns against Antifa-terrorism actions and demand an end to restrictions on your Second Amendment rights. We strongly advise citizens of Randolph County, Illinois, to be ready, whatever legal weapons you may still have in your possession, and to prepare to support your local law enforcement in defending your homes, farms, and towns against this potential Antifa-terrorism invasion. We were warned in publishing this article that Antifa would simply move their target to another town in Illinois, but we decided to move ahead with publishing this anyway, as refraining from publishing this intel would be irresponsible. We further urge all citizens of Illinois to demand an end to restrictions on your Second Amendment rights, as these Antifa riots have made it abundantly clear that police cannot protect you or have been ordered not to protect you in many cities. This means that, especially for rural Americans, your personal security is now up to you. And I will say this, for every American, your security is now dependent on you. If you're not planning to protect yourself, you are a victim in waiting. Do not trust authorities to serve you. And whether you're left or right-leaning, you might disagree with who you want to support, but in any case, you're at risk. So you need to be able to defend yourself and your family and those you care about. And if you can talk to people around you, that will be good. And if you have a bigger bubble, you'll be a lot safer. The Randolph County Sheriff's deputies can't be everywhere at once. If you want to be safe in rural Illinois, you first need to defeat Antifa terrorists and then secondly call for the arrest of Chicago lawmakers who have committed treason against this nation by suppressing your right to self-defense. And I will say, so you see this committed treason against this nation. This is what you're going to see. The right is going to call this treason and a breaking of law. The left is going to call this a revolution designed to suppress blacks. This is a fight. Those two narratives cannot coexist, and that's why this fight's going to happen. And there might be, who knows, if there's a third way out, maybe it's in Maine. I'll try to make it happen. But ultimately, this is going to be a very hard narrative for anyone to escape, because it's ultimately forcing people to really make decisions. And because it goes along identity lines, you're kind of stuck. I mean, realistically, you can't be a white guy unless you're willing to kneel in the left. It's just the way it is. And I know people tell me otherwise, and I don't believe it for 1 second. Conversely, if you're a minority, it's hard to be in the right. You get attacked by your own groups. It's tough. And we need to create some bridges instead of all these ladders being torn down and all these fights. And I'm trying, man. It's hard, though. I tell you, it's really hard. And there's some really awful people get in there. And I'll tell you one other thing, too, and this is just me being honest with you, is if I have 10 interactions in a day, and 6 are decent, and 3 are great, and 1 is awful, I can't get past the one awful one. I really have a hard time swallowing my hate. And it is hatred, and I know it's hatred, and I got to be honest about what it is. And they say things that I just think are just so dumb and stupid and self-defeating. I'm like, these people need to be put aside so I don't ever have to deal with them. And I know everyone feels that way these days, and how we get around that. I mean, we need to find more of us who can talk to one another. And if we have to exclude other people from it, fine. Exclusion is the process by which logic comes to the root. If people are going to be crazy, you can't save everyone. We did that with the coronavirus, and I think we got to do it again now with this. And if I have a different group of people I'm saving, well, at least I'm doing the job I believe in, because I know I'm going to lose some people and gain some people, and that's just the way of it. Anyway, the Second Amendment debate is now over. Anyone who wants to survive the Antifa uprisings is getting armed. Any state with self-defense rights are restricted is a state that effectively sides with the terrorists. And so people have asked me, are you redrawing the map? Well, that's going to be it. If governors start fighting the federal government, which is where we might go. I haven't commented on it yet, but I'm watching. I'm thinking it might happen. Ultimately, you may end up having those maps that we draw earlier have a lot of relevance, except the difference is if we're not fighting over COVID, but we're fighting an active, I hate to say it, but race war. And what will happen is that it will really be the cities versus the countryside, and governors will find their cities ungovernable. Rural Illinois will not listen to Governor Pritzker any more than, pick another example, or rural, it's not a good example, but places in Massachusetts aren't going to listen to Governor Baker either, you know what I mean? It's just one of those things. If you have a blue city, what would be a good example? Memphis might not listen to Governor Lee, let's say down in Tennessee. That might be a better example. Or Miami listening to DeSantis. That isn't happening in any universe. So we'll see what happens. And where you live really matters. And that's why I'm saying to you, if you can get out, you better get out. You better know where you are and be in a place you belong, because your life may very well rely upon it. And people think I'm being too severe about this, but I don't. I really believe this, because there's no one to pull it back together. That's the problem. Let's see. The towns where Antifa is failing to cause mayhem are the towns where local citizens are walking around with AR-15s slung across their chests. And I will say, you're not just seeing that in the rural areas. You're seeing black militias being created to form and to protect your own neighborhoods. We've seen Hispanic ones in Chicago, and that's fine. I have no problem. People should be able to protect their property and their rights, regardless of what it is. It's smart. I mean, in the old days, before civil rights, it was not uncommon in the rural South and black communities actually to do that and to protect their resources and their assets, and God bless them. should be able to do that. Why not? I mean, the thing is, people who are rioting are destroying stuff that isn't theirs. And really, it's a problem. The article closes, "Tonight we pray for all the citizens of rural Illinois who are about to be targeted by unbridled left-wing violence and mayhem. They will kill your cattle, set fire to your homes, terrorize your towns, and the left-wing media will defend these terrorists and their peaceful, quote, protests. Prepare to defend your communities or watch them burn to the ground." So this is what people are preparing for. This is the real world of what people are talking about on the internet. And even if your world isn't as crazy as this is really what you're seeing on the ground. So you tell me how you pull those sides back together. I sure as hell don't know. And I'm pretty good at understanding these sort of things. So now we're going to talk about what is happening here and what are some results that we are seeing. And then we're going to think about what is actually happening. So first thing, as this thing falls apart, this piece is by the Heisenberg, and it's a small piece on economics, but I think it's pretty good. "A record-shattering collapse in U.S. trade and globalization's nail in the coffin moment." So the old world of globalization and trade is dead. That's what this piece makes, and I will read it and go through it. And this is before the riots even really got super, super heavy. June 4th, and the person's name, I don't know their real name. They have the real Heisenberg, and they have the symbol up that looks like the dude from Breaking Bad, the Bryan Cranston art character, Walter White. "By now, we all know that global trade and commerce suffered a grievous blow from COVID and the associated lockdown protocols across the nation. In fact, I'd imagine the economic collapse that unfolded during the first half of 2020 will eventually be described as the economist as one of the single largest demand shocks of the modern era, whatever your definition of modernity happens to be. Of course, it was also a supply shock, as the flow of goods and services was curtailed by unprecedented shut-ins. Global trade shrank the most since the financial crisis in March, according to the Dutch government planning agency CPB, and it's likely to get worse once the delayed numbers for April are in. The World Trade Organization has warned world merchandise trade is set to plunge between 13 and 32% in 2020 due to the pandemic. Given all of this, I suppose you could argue there's little utility in flagging the collapse in U.S. trade that unfolded in April as the documented data out Thursday. After all, it was expected. We know it was bad. Why rubberneck the car crash? Can't we just look forward to brighter days? But readers will begrudgingly agree we'd all be derelict in our roles as keen observers of markets, witnesses to the unfolding macro narrative, not at least to acknowledge the world's largest economy logged the biggest decline in exports in comparable figures going back to more than a quarter century in April. So they're saying that we are not exporting goods. So trade is going away. What does this mean? Economies are going to renationalize, and that's going to lead to militarism because trade is a stabilizing force because when you want things from someone, you work with them, whereas if you don't have things and they give you a hard time, you're more likely to mess with them. And this is part of the story, this detachment of America from the international structure. And it's not that all international trade is going, I mean, a lot is, but we have to look at if the U.S. is a different pattern. Shipments plunged 20.5% for the month, the BEA said on Thursday, the most dramatic drop in data going back to 1992 and more than double March's decline, which was itself a record. Imports plunged nearly 14% over the month. That, too, is a record. The overall trade deficit was the widest in 8 months, but that's an afterthought at this point. Nobody cares about the trade deficit anymore, and most economists will tell you that at least as far as bilateral deficits are concerned, trade gaps are not the appropriate focus of policymakers. And to be fair, one of the things that does go into that is as much as there's a trade gap with China does buy a lot of U.S. currency as a quid pro quo, but if you think about it from a strategic perspective, if the way China balances out its trade deficit that they sell more goods to the U.S. is to buy U.S. dollars, it really creates a double vulnerability to the U.S. that both we get our goods from them and we're counting on them to prop up our dollar, and that's what happens when you have an economy based on consumerism. It's deliberately unsustainable, and it's funny that the titans of capitalism are supporting communism in a lot of ways in the streets because they understand that all of this is a means to an end towards a planned destruction that's been talked about for a very, very long time. And there are hints and pieces if you want to find it, if you're willing to find the big picture and you're willing to ask tough questions. It goes without saying the worsening tensions with China aren't going to help this situation. Indeed, another Sino-U.S. trade war will spill over into other trade-sensitive economies like Japan and South Korea, and before you know it, it'll be 2018 all over again, only in a U.S. election year. You shouldn't kid yourself. In addition to the first-order effects of the pandemic on global trade and commerce, the damage from supply, demand, and supply shocks, the events of the last 4 months are set to reinvigorate the protectionist push and prompt countries to consider onshoring in an effort to protect supply chains. Without being melodramatic, COVID is like the last nail in the coffin of globalization, Carmen Reinhart told Bloomberg late last month. The 2008-2009 crisis gave globalization a big hit, as did Brexit, as did the U.S.-China trade war, but COVID is taking it to a new level. And it's going to get even more so because the U.S. is a consumer economy where everything being consumed is destroyed, right? So you're going to end up having these situations where people are going out there and they're not feeling comfortable. So let's look at what's happening in places. This was reported in The Guardian, June 4th, that's Thursday, by Sam T. Levine. Movement to defund police gains unprecedented support across the U.S. Activists say the way to stop police brutality and killing is to cut law enforcement budgets and reinvest in services. Some lawmakers now agree. The movement to defund the police is gaining significant support across America, including from elected leaders, as protests over the killing of George Floyd sweep the nation. So what does this mean? That there are going to be places that basically don't have laws, and what will happen is new laws will be put in with a new structure. You have to destroy the old before you build the new, and the strength of the radical left has always been in the cities. They have selective enforcement of laws, and they've already been breaking away. You don't believe that? Take immigration as an example. If you believe laws exist and we should follow them, that people who are here illegally should be removed. And I'm not speaking to their decency as individuals, but I'm just saying if you believe in the rule of law. And yet the complete opposite has been done for many years, that there's been a deliberate re-rigging of who's there, and it's been done in opposition to Washington. So as you look at this leftist separation happening in the cities, and you see the police removal as part of it, what it does is it allows the creation of alternate structures of governance. And that's what makes a civil war, when you have different levels of authority saying, no, you're not legitimate, we're legitimate. And so the federal government's monopoly on state violence is having to be used in the most naked way to hold this together, and that's where it's going to have to go. And the question is if people will support it. And the right wing will, largely because they think that ideologically it agrees with their outcomes. And the left wing won't, because ideologically they see him as a fascist and a tyrant. The truth is, Donald Trump is a 1980s New York Democrat that's just been painted in a really horrible light, who's being forced in a lot of ways, in the same way they actually have it with Pinochet, or even Mussolini, who was a socialist, into acting a certain way. And people do evolve, and I'm not saying he may not become that way. In fact, Trump's best way to survive is to try to become another Caesar. So if he's smart enough, he'll actually do that. And whether people are okay with that or not, they have to realize this is the response that ends up coming for certain events. Or you may see him displaced, in which case there will be a coup and a right-wing insurrection will happen. If President Trump is removed, I am predicting, I will tell you, the right wing will go ahead and uprise in this country, and then we'll fight a different sort of war and see what happens, because there's so little trust, and there are no people who can come in between. And I've seen a lot of chatter lately, people saying Jim Mattis could jump in there as a respected individual, but I'm not sure I believe that. It's an interesting gambit. We'll see how it plays out. Anyway, for years, activists have pushed U.S. cities and states to cut law enforcement budgets amid a dramatic rise in spending on police and prisons, while funding for vital social services has shrunk or disappeared altogether. Government officials have long dismissed the idea of leftist fantasy, but the recent unrest and massive budget shortfalls from COVID appear to have inspired more mainstream recognition of the central arguments behind defunding. And hey, let's not give funding to the police, let's just give it direct to the people. That's what's going to happen. And it's going to be a popular thing, actually. It's going to make sense to a lot of people. And there's reasons why it will work, but the thing is, who is getting power? Who's making these decisions? You want to make the argument so you be in charge. And look, I'm a politician. I understand this. You make arguments because you think they're going to give you influence. To see legislators who aren't even necessarily on the left supporting at least a significant decrease in New York Police Department funding is really very encouraging, said Julia Salazar, New York State Senator and Democratic Socialist, told The Guardian on Tuesday. It feels a little bit surreal. And they had that in New York in the 1970s, actually. The crime was through the roof. And that's something you commonly deal with as a trade-off for that, but people do have a certain limited bottom that comes up a bit, even though everyone gets poor collectively. Floyd's death on camera in Minneapolis, advocates say, was a powerful demonstration that police reform efforts of the last half-decade have failed to stop racist policing and killings. Although, remember, I told you that, in fact, police brutality is committed beyond race, but they, once again, it fits a narrative. Meanwhile, the striking visuals of enormous militarized and sometimes violent police forces responding to peaceful protests, are they peaceful protests? Because one side, they tell you they're heroes out there protesting the death of someone. On the other side, you see a well-coordinated effort that's committing violence and multiple players with scouts. So what is true? And this is where you see the rhetoric. I'm just tearing apart the narrative. And I tear it apart on both sides, by the way. It's this. You just need to see that this narrative is creating an illusion that we're believing. And we have two divergent illusions, and more than two, but two major ones. responding have led to some politicians to question whether police really need this much money and firepower. Meanwhile, unemployment is surging amid the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, with housing and healthcare crises worsening. Remember all that stuff we talked about with the evictions? That's coming. So you're going to have more people pushed out to the streets, and they're going to be really pissed off. And what happened? These governments let them happen a lot of times, including leftist governments who you think would say we're going to have an ongoing rent moratorium, but they're not doing that. Why? Because they're upping the pressure. Many governments have been making painful cuts to services and expect to see tax revenue fall even further in the coming year, but police budgets have not been affected, and some mayors are even seeking to expand law enforcement funding. A snapshot of some city budget debates have escalated this week. Los Angeles, the police budget is $1.8 billion, and the mayor for weeks has been pushing for raises and bonuses for officers and an overall 7% increase that would make the budget more than half the general fund. But on Wednesday, he said he was now looking to make cuts to the police budget. And what's going to happen is police are going to quit. That's what's going to happen. I mean, you know this. And they're already going to quit because they're being asked to stand down and put their own lives at risk, like the officer who died in New York City, he didn't die, he had a brick thrown at him to break his helmet, and people were laughing. He's just out there doing his job, you know? And I understand the Eichmann defense. I get it, but this is the conflict coming into place. I mean, do we want to live in a society of lawlessness? I mean, that's what Somalia is like. You have militias and war bands and lawlessness, and I can't help but notice that Minneapolis has an incredible amount of people who came from there. They're adopting a model of home, which culturally makes sense, but if that's the America you want, that's the story you have to decide. It's an America where you don't have the sort of injustices, you just don't have wealth and prosperity either. New York, the mayor is pushing to leave the New York Police Department's nearly $6 billion budget intact while slashing education and youth programs and cutting other agencies by as much as 80%. And remember, all these places are going to lose a lot of sales tax and revenue, so they're going to be having to do more with less. And that's what creates that revolutionary impulse that we were reading on the Washington Post. Philadelphia, the mayor has proposed spending $977 million on police and prisons, which is 20% of the general fund. A $14 million increase for police comes as the city is cutting funding for youth violence prevention, arts and culture, workforce development, and laying off staff at recreation centers and libraries. Defunding, said activist Geraldine Bluford, is a logical response from leaders in this moment of unprecedented unrest. If the police had been serious about reform and policy change, then guess what? People would not be this angry. Bluford's son was killed by Oakland police in 2012, and she's been fighting for reform since. And these leaders, and I'm not taking anything away from them or the causes they fight, but they always are emotionally invested, and we have to be able to look at this with cold, cool, clinical detachment. You have to be almost a reptilian person to deal with this, because that's what the people who are doing this against you, they think this way. They know how to work this way, and they separate themselves so they do. So whether they're hiding out in the country on their estate, or they're in New Zealand that shut its borders and keeps itself safe, these are the things we're dealing with. And the rest of them are just kind of useless people, or I should say not useless, useful idiots that are being used, including you and me many times. We can't help it, because we're stuck in a system where our survival is dependent on tools other people use as whim, like the money system. And it's just one money system, propaganda system, media system, even this hero worship that we're given in a lot of ways for ideologies. I mean, ideology is just a way of dividing people against one another and against their own interest. It puts a system in place of what's actual human interest, and it's an incredibly dehumanizing thing that's at the heart of what all these advocates pretty much are supporting at this point, whether they be for nationalist in terms of fighting, just to have the government impose authority as law and order, that's a system, or if you think that, you're fighting racial prejudice and you want to have different structures removed, you're still fighting for a system sort of logic rather than actually fighting for people. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are. I don't want to be that clear about, but this is why things don't work. Let's see. We allowed you to kill our children, said Bluford, and you said this was going to change, and you reneged on it. If we keep funding them, it gives them the green light to continue. Community groups advocating for defunding have put forward differing strategies, some merely opposing police budget increases, others advocating mass reductions, and some fighting for full defunding as a step toward abolishing police forces. Some initiatives are tied to the fight to close prisons. All are pushing for a reinvestment of those dollars in services. Amid the protests, some local leaders with budgeting powers have started proposing modest cuts to policing. The most substantial change so far has come in Minneapolis, where the school board on Tuesday voted to end its contract with the police department. The University of Minnesota has also pledged to stop working with police. People have been fighting for years to get cops out of schools, and now it's happening overnight, said Tony Williams, member of MPD 150, an abolition group whose literature on building a police-free future has spread on social media in recent days. One elected Minneapolis ward said this week the city's police department was irredeemably beyond reform, the kind of remark that until recently would have been unthinkable to organizers. This is unprecedented in our movement, but it is a natural consequence of where we've been over the last 5 years, Williams said, rattling off high-profile killings by police that have failed to lead to substantive reforms. Eric Garcetti, the Los Angeles mayor, addressed the broader protests in a speech late Wednesday night and said he was now working to make cuts of up to $150 million to the police budget and reinvest funds in black communities. Those specifics of his plans were unclear. His move comes after a coalition convened by Black Lives Matter Los Angeles pushed for what it called a people's budget, which encouraged the city to spend only 5.7% of its general fund on law enforcement and 44% on universal aid and crisis management. In moment of crisis, people want service and resources that go directly to help the people rather than the police that surveil, brutalize, and kill us, said Melina Abdullah, BLM's LA's co-founder, adding that Garcetti's proposed cut was minimal and officials need to go much further. Even though many U.S. police departments' duties are responding to nonviolent, non-emergency calls, departments have expanded their military-style arsenal in recent years. U.S. police kill more people in days than many other countries do in years. And so let's talk about why the militarization of police happened for 1 second. Let's go back a little bit, because it really wasn't about race. It was about the drug war and the SWAT units that came out of Los Angeles. The government created a drug war where the government actually funded the drugs in the CIA that came into the cities, that killed a bunch of people disproportionately in the 80s in the black community again, and that ultimately it created the problem where it created the solution, which is it had stronger police forces because it brought the drugs into the country that would cause these problems. And if you ever want to know something about how deep that goes, look up a little place called Mena, Arkansas. It's pretty infamous, and this drug running has happened for a very long time. It goes back to, in fact, it goes back before World War II when the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds ran opium out of China, and that's what a lot of those wars were about. This is not new. A lot of money's been involved in drugs, and, we live in a Breaking Bad kind of world. So that is at the heart of why police departments exist, and there's always been this weird, codependency. Think of civil asset forfeiture as an example, where police departments get all sorts of cool toys from the drug dealers given to them that they just take right into their budget. And complete violation, by the way, of the Fourth Amendment, but the courts don't enforce it because the state isn't about to undermine its own authority. Why the hell would it do that? And that's a really important point in this. And I'm not here, like I said, to defend police or the militarization of police, but I want you to go ahead and know what actually happens with this. And to be fair, there's a lot of good cops doing a bad job and they're trying to protect people, but they're in a system that's basically making them into the villains, and they have to realize that. And that's why a lot of cops basically either just collect a paycheck and drive around or have quit. And so with no one to protect their society and no common belief to hold us together, now we head towards anarchy and chaos. And who likes that? Well, anarchists like it. And that's why you're seeing people form up into militias around sheriffs and posses in the country at the same time that you're seeing these city rioting mobs. And the question is, everyone's looking over each side of the suburbs at each other saying, this fight is coming. And I predicted it. I predicted it years ago that this was coming, but I certainly wasn't the first one. People have been looking at this for 20 years, and that is what we're looking at. And if you remove the police, well, what's going to happen is they're going to go over there, and then you're going to see, as things move away from that lawless zone, they're going to say, justice needs to be brought to the country. The suburbs will not be permitted to take all of our businesses and steal and appropriate the people's wealth. And this is how a Bolshevik revolution actually shakes out. And so the people will have to fight in the country against them, and that's probably where we're going. I mean, I'd like that there be another way, but we have to find it and we have to create it. And to be honest, our voices probably aren't loud enough against the throngs of angry, passionate, hurt-screaming people who don't like, don't trust, and don't look like one another. Those are not a good way to pull people together. And you might say, idealistically, you want to believe in something else. I'd like to believe in something else, too. But this is realism. This is the world we live in. Anyway, Senator Salazar in New York said the COVID devastation is motivating lawmakers normally sympathetic to the New York PD to rethink the budget. Every Senate office has been fielding an unfathomable number of unemployment claims, and we're up over 40 million now. It's absolutely crazy, and it's just getting worse all the time, and businesses can't survive in this. And let's be honest, businesses are not going out there. The only people who are making money is people who are buying goods, preparing for days to come, which, by the way, if you're not doing, what are you waiting for? I've been telling you, you need to be in front of it, and, hopefully you listened. If you did, you're in much better shape. I will say I saw freezers for sale. I haven't seen them forever. Go get one. Home Depot. Good luck. Every Senate office has been fielding an unfathomable... Okay, we said that. We've been thinking every day about how social services and the public safety net are failing people, having come out of a bleak state budget process. It's very frustrating to hear that $6 billion number for the New York PD. And remember, unemployment's about to be bankrupt. Towns are running out of money. The banks are the only ones who are funding towns yet. The government won't do it. The federal government is basically become an unworkable mess. And they're going to go into yet another impeachment fight. At the time, people are in economic insecurity. What's it going to do? It's going to cause radicalization and violence to recur. And any sort of outcome that doesn't bring people together is bad. And the time for bringing it together on the basis that we're going to bring as one isn't going to work. Groups of us may come together for our own self-defense, but that's where we're at in this game. Okay, now where were we? The city council member who chairs the committee that oversees the budget called for significant New York Police Department cuts this week. Although she doesn't control NYPD financing as a state lawmaker, Salazar said she could envision police immediately losing $1 billion from its budget just for current police functions that have nothing to do with law enforcement and crime, such as responding to mental health calls and other social services. I mean, and that's not necessarily great either, right? Kamal Walton, a Philadelphia-based member of Critical Resistance, a long-running U.S. abolition group. And let me say one other thing, because I got to say this. That all these nonprofit groups, by the way, lean left, and they get a lot of money from the left, and they've been out there a long time because they've interfaced and interacted with ways in the right that have branded them as being unconscionable. And the right lost control of its churches, and there isn't a right wing other than in memory and imagination at this point like there used to be. It just doesn't exist. So all this institutionality has a lean and a tilt to it because money came in to push it in a certain direction. And we could go back into the 60s and talk about why that is one day, and maybe we will if I continue forward with this podcast. Or if you're curious, I wrote hints of it in my book, Someone Has to Say It, The Hidden History of How America Was Lost. But these are things that are out there. So you see all these different groups that are presented as authorities, and they always say critical resistance. Like you could define, and Mike Adams would define something like that as a terrorist group, but yet these people are presented in the most positive lights. And so where you place legitimacy is at the heart of this story, and that's what the fight is over. Who is legitimate and who isn't? And we're going to disagree massively. And if we can't come to a new agreement that's rooted in values, we're going to fight based over identities. And that's what it is. I mean, I've never said it as clearly as that, but that's what it is. America must come to an agreement based on values, or we fight over identity. And if we fight over identity, then at the end of it, our identity will be stable, and it'll be based on whoever wins. And we'll either have, one version of a country, another, or some new patchwork of entities, which is probably more likely. Anyways, Critical Resistance, a long-running U.S. abolition group, said the absurdity of increased police spending in this moment was visible to many. Walton lives across from a recreation center and library that has been closed due to COVID, and said houseless people now gather outside because they have nowhere else to go. The city, however, is further cutting housing and homelessness services and seems to lack a summer plan for those communities who have lost programs, resources, and jobs, they said. At a drop of a dime, they can find money for uber-militarized tanks and fly helicopters all over the city and shoot rubber bullets, but we just can't put people in houses. Kelly Little Hernandez, UCLA historian and recent MacArthur recipient, said this could be a pivotal moment for the U.S. We've created over the last 30 to 40 years a sense that our safety and well-being always comes from investing more and more in police. This week, it seems that there's increasing recognition of its failures, she said, adding, defunding the police is the first step in a much broader historical transformation I'm hoping you'll see broad-based support for on the streets today. So this is what's interesting. And let me speak to what Ms. Hernandez said, because it's true. I mean, it is a question. We do invest a lot of money in police. We do invest a lot of money in military. And could it be better spent? Maybe. I think it's a totally legitimate question. It's a conversation we could have. But the fact that we're having it right now, where certain people are really well suited to take advantage of it and their ideological allies, is why 30 to 50% of the country thinks they'd rather fight war than let this justice happen. And that's because they know, they listen, they read what they're saying, they see what they're doing, and they know they're going to be targeted. And so we understand that when we understand that fights. But let's get to the practical, right? Let's get down to the micro in this and say, what's going to happen? Well, these sort of things happened. There were the riots in Detroit. It was in 1968. Detroit was the richest city in America in the turn of the last century, and it's one of the poorest, most dilapidated ones. Now, what happened was white flight happened, and everyone said, I'm looking for a better school district. You're not looking for a better school district. You're looking to get away from the horde you think is going to cause problems, and there's reasons that are good and reasons that are bad, but that's the truth. Minneapolis is dead as a city. If you live in Minnesota, unfortunately, it is not going to have the economic growth and vitality. The city will still exist, but it will never be what it was. It will be angry suburbs ringing a city. That's what happens in American social development. It happened in Detroit, happened in places in Los Angeles. It's a common feature, and now that we have efforts to push people out from the city, believe me. I've never seen so many out-of-state plates going around rural Maine in my life as in the last couple of weeks. Everyone is getting out of Dodge because they understand, anyone with means understands that this thing is going to be very different. So what you're going to see is, interestingly, a reinvestment in what we call the exurbs. The suburbs are going to be a place of really uncomfortable tension where people in the middle are stuck, not knowing what to do, and you're going to see rural folk and city folk sniping at one another, politically, economically, and perhaps militarily to some extent if this develops, especially if the federal government doesn't reassert authority and is not able to do so, which we'll see. That's the next step in this play. Trump is going to come in with the forces. Eventually, there will be a big attack that will be blamed on someone, which will either be legitimate or not legitimate, but it will destroy something a lot of people care about. The branding of the protest will be terrorism, and there will be a fight, over who wins that branding war, even as this is ongoing. And one side may win it, in which case they will recognize the benefits, or it may be muddled enough, which is more likely, that the fight just continues to expand and go out of control, because, as I always tell you people, blood sanctifies conflict, and that's where we're ending up in. But let's look at it from the cold realm of finance. If you're a business, do you want to be dealing with this? If you're a small business, you're not going to open. If you think you're going to be rioting, you're not going to go out there. If people are out there and they don't have money, what are you going to make money with? And the unemployment will continue and expand, and you don't have money coming into the state, so they won't be able to provide resources. So the anger becomes a self-perpetuating fire. And don't think Antifa doesn't know that. They know this very well. They know the history of 1917 as well as I do, and I will tell you, for the interest of transparency, my family was part of the Russian aristocracy that got kicked out in that time period. So if I trace back through my mother's line, I can go back to that, and I understand these things have happened. This has happened many times in history, and we think in America we're exceptional. This is normal in history. This happens a lot, and something's going to come out of it. And in a lot of ways, we're reenacting the 20s and 30s and the late teens. So we'll see what happens. In some countries, you'll see this happen. It'll lean left, and some will lean right, and different areas will divide. And some countries got split up out of this. That was not uncommon. But what happens is big business, even though they want to give a lot of money to things like let's say, Black Lives Matter. Let's share this piece. This is from WBBM 780 Radio out of Chicago. And Chicago is having a lot of really awful fights where neighborhood to neighborhood people are forming militias, basically defend themselves based on either racial or different efforts. And they literally have Latino groups. I'm being told this from 3 different sources that are literally going around keeping neighborhoods safe against black groups that are going around rioting. They're being transported, and while the police are just sitting there watching this. This is the reality on the ground. I'm not speaking to justice. I'm just saying this is what people are reporting. You can believe what you want to believe, or, if you want to hear a nice anesthetized version of what's happening that makes things sound good and easy, there's plenty of other sources out there. If you want to hear the real thing that's happening, the radical center's right here. We're going to tell both sides of the story. We're going to be radical where it makes sense, and we're going to try to do our own damn thing because these people are all nuts and they're going to get us all killed. Anyway, Mayor Lori Lightfoot pleads with Walmart other retailers not to abandon Chicago. This piece was written by Craig Dellamore on June 4th, and this is what's going to start happening. She went to all economic destruction. Chicago, WBBM News Radio. Mayor Lightfoot said she's hopeful major retailers will reopen the Chicago stores that were damaged or otherwise were looted or otherwise damaged during protests surrounding George Floyd's killing by police in Minnesota, but she's unsure of one of the biggest. Mayor Lightfoot said she was on a conference call with Walmart and other major retailers that had stores looted or heavily damaged during the unrest in Chicago. She said she pleaded with them not to abandon Chicago. I think in the case of Walmart, what they were focused on was assessing the damage. They're doing an effort to donate fresh produce to the extent of what's left so it doesn't perish, and other perishables, and they're taking their time as I would expect. There were earlier reports that Walmart expected to rebuild all stores trashed by looters and vandals, but company officials later said they would open some stores and would not say which ones. The mayor said most of the others said they're committed to Chicago. She hopes Walmart follows suit. My hope is that they will come back, Lightfoot said. But I got a resounding, Mayor, this is our city, this is our home, from a lot of retailers, and I would hope that Walmart would follow suit. Okay, so local companies are going to stay. Big corporate businesses are going to pull out. Why wouldn't you pull out? There's a lot of damage. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of harm. And if we have, as I anticipate we will have this weekend, despite the many curfews in place, huge overwhelming protests, police stand-downs, and the imposition of National Guard to further escalate this crisis, what's going to happen is businesses are going to go where it's safe. Capital flight, just like white flight, is a thing, and people look for zones of stability in times of chaos. And so that is what, as much as anything, is going to drive the sides in this conflict going forward. People in stable places are going to organize in self-defense against the imposition of people who are acting in places that are a lot less stable, where you see this unrest being deliberately stoked. And if you go around and look out there, you can find, if you want to see them, I'm not going to celebrate everything, but they're out there. You can look at the Project Veritas videos about people getting paid to basically have a pyramid scheme. They get paid $200 a day to go out there and protest. And they get paid more if they bring more people to the protest. So what do? Someone with limitless money is putting out there the same sort of thing we saw in the Maidan in Ukraine, that we saw in Tahrir Square in Egypt, we saw in Tunisia, that we've seen over and over again. This is how deep states fund revolutions. And the fact that they're not trying to stop it means they want it to happen. So you have to decide if you want the very wealthy and the very powerful to allow this revolution to happen, or if you want something else. And that's where you're at in this sort of narrative. And I can't tell you what everyone intends, and I'm not telling you that there are good guys and bad guys. It's that simple. And I'm not saying that the revolutionaries are necessarily wrong in all their intents, or that the government's the good guy in this. I'm not going to insult your intelligence like that. But I want you to understand your interest, where you place in the system, what works for your safety and your well-being, and allow you to ask the questions and challenge the narrative that's being delivered to you. I've presented to you 5 or 6 different ways of looking at this case that is the same exact situation, with facts selectively chosen to support a certain interpretation. And which one do you want to believe? But I will tell you, most of these don't lead to happy places. And so we go back to that story that we started with by Ted Anthony, the American story splintered in those vying to tell it. I'm out here telling you a story just like anyone else, but the question is, what story are you going to tell yourself? And you can lie to anyone else, but you should never lie to yourself, because ultimately if you live a lie, that's when you get hurt. That's when you die, because you did something so stupid, because you believe something that's not true, that you know is not true. And it's okay to be uncertain, and it's okay to have aspirations, but you shouldn't lie to yourself. That's the one thing I would implore each and every one of the listeners here today who've listened to this very long podcast, which, by the way, now represents episodes 77 and 78, or excuse me, 78 and 79. I put together a long enough episode to make up for the fact, as a treat, that I was not able to give you one on Wednesday, because I was getting my computer fixed, and now that I have my computer fixed, I can tell you the story. So, as we come to close in this, a couple points I want to make. Number one, from a pragmatic perspective, be safe this weekend. Don't look for violence. Don't let violence look for you. And whatever you come up with, I would really recommend don't lead with violence. If you do that, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to get very hurt that way. And Lord knows if I do anything political, I'm not going to try to do that either. You need to be able to be smart, be rational, be prepared, have goods on hand, and understand that these disruptions only will serve to exacerbate every other existing trend. You're worried about coronavirus, a lot more people are going to get sick, and when it's all the protesters getting sick and they still want money for police to stop them and not healthcare, look how mad they're going to be. You're worried about economic supply disruptions. Truckers are already driving around major cities, and when country folk decide that the city folk are just going to wreck everything anyway, a lot of those truckers who live there are going to decide, you know what, the hell with this, I'm not going to do it. And these lines of bifurcation that are going to happen are going to become much more pronounced, especially when we see more rioters go out there, and we see innocent people who are probably out there just thinking they're protesting, who are really upset about what happened to George Floyd, be the victims that get sacrificed at the altar of political expediency. And you will see both sides try to play the narrative that way. Both sides are going to try to play the victim. The left is going to talk about terrible people getting hurt, or not terrible people, the terrible tragedy of people getting hurt who were just protesting and showing their freedom of speech. The right is going to show images of heroic officers and monuments being damaged. And both sides are going to be mad as hell at one another, and it's going to get worse. And eventually, shooting may stop, from which no one can come back from it. If that happens, man, and the fight happens, all I can say is know who you can work with and try to survive. And that could happen as early as this weekend, or could not happen at all. This situation has too many variables, and it could very, very quickly spiral out of control. So what's your strategy? I'm going to assume you're not a crazy person who wants to get involved with this political conflict. I've been dumb enough to do it before, and I might be dumb enough to do it again. But I will say, for most people, it's a very dumb play, and you shouldn't be involved with it. What you should be doing is protecting your own safety. Be aware of your neighborhood. Be aware of your environments. Be able to provide for your own security, and use the opportunities you have to stock and store additional supply. I tell you constantly, that's what you need to be doing, adding supply. And when all this shakes out, money might not be worth anything. So what you have on hand is really going to be of value to you. So if you have the opportunity to collateralize your assets into something useful, keep in mind that's going to be valuable. Because if the radical left wins, ultimately the old dollar is going to die, and you're going to have something new put in that's going to be probably you're going to have UBI, which I think would be good in some ways, but you're also going to have a very few you're going to have the old dictatorship of the proletariat. And if the right wins, you're going to have the imposition of nationalist forces that's going to put law and order on people, but ultimately there will be a few rich corporations running everything in a centralized structure. What you notice is in either side winning, the people at the bottom, even though they might be taken care of differently, are basically getting screwed. And this is the problem with revolutions. Revolutions really don't help the lower class. Revolutions are how people who are upwardly aspirational at the higher class seek to undo people who are above them, or to further strengthen their position, because they have resources and reflections, and they don't have to worry about things that you and I have to worry about every day. So those are things you should be very aware of and keep an eye on. People always ask me for recommendations. Research, if you are inclined to do a deep dive, look at what happened in the French Revolution, look at what happened in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Those will give you a lot of context that I think will be highly relevant to this. And remember, the Russian Revolution only succeeded because, Jacob Astor basically gave the equivalent of $1.5 billion to help them. So it was Wall Street financiers that were helping some of their brethren over there in the Soviet Union that basically displaced the Tsar. Expect to see that happen again. I saw a story that said the Bank of America is literally going to give $1 billion to Black Lives Matter. I don't know if that's true or not, and I haven't done the research to claim it, but if they are, it's really a curious thing how history repeats itself, because people who make money out of thin air know that it's just a tool to be used, and when they have the opportunity to change something radically, they like to take the chance. Not saying radical change is bad, not saying it isn't necessary. Lord knows this country's messed up. We need a new story. Be part of writing it in a better way, and that's what we're going to try to do here. We're going to try to find that new radical center. So let me say a prayer, and then I'll make one more comment. Heavenly Father, we just pray that you give us the wisdom to do as Jesus did and to be the peacemakers in the time of conflict, not people who were afraid of fights, like when he went into the temple to rebuke the money changers for the way they lived their world, but who understood the decency and integrity of all people, and that each of us having souls, we can be saved and we can find our way to truth if you help guide us. And I ask that everyone, be able to learn to pray for the wisdom, that voice inside, the comforter that helps us understand that what is right and what is wrong, and that we see past our momentary passions and our vices that are driven by our fears, uncertainties, desires, hopes, loves, dreams, and we find something better, and that we find, if we root it in truth, perhaps the one you suggest for us, we might find a much happier solution. I know that I've already been attacked now as a bad Christian, that I was attacked as an evil Christian, not that I was evil for being a Christian, but because I went ahead and said that one group was different than another group. And I just ask that you provide support for me and everyone who's willing to speak truth as we come under moral and psychic attack, which I know will happen, and from which I am very, very tired. And I ask that you give your protection over the entire audience as they walk this terrible path that we're all going to be forced to walk, and I ask that your justice comes soon. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm a tired man. I'm not going to lie to you. I have told a very long story, and I didn't expect things to evolve this way, this fast. I really thought we were going to have a quiet summer and things weren't going to get nuts, but it's my own oversight that people would see an opportunity and someone would take advantage of it. And whether it's international actors, transnational actors, domestic actors, it doesn't matter. I can tell you the story. You guys got to tell me if you want me to keep telling it, because I need to know. Consider it a cry for help. If you want me to tell it, I'll tell it. I mean, I don't really need rebukes. And if too many people piss me off, I'll just quit. I don't care, because I have other things I could do. But I know some of you really value this. I know some of you use it to keep your family afloat. I should mention, actually, if you want the Venmo CVC PRV, but people helped get us over the thing, and then P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. But more than that, I'm looking for your words, I'm looking for your thoughts, I'm looking for an understanding. I mean, do you want to see the world less ugly? Do you want this story to be told? I'll tell it, and I will tell you one other thing. I'm telling it to you as someone who's going to probably be a participant in it before it's all said and done. So if you're okay with that and you want that to continue, you let me know. And if not, hey, it's been good. I've been trying. I don't regret that I tried to keep people safe, although the same people will probably be trying to kill me soon enough. Ironies of life, right? I guess that's how Caesar felt about Brutus. He went out of his way to save the kid, and then he stabs him to go ahead and lead to even worse situations. But this is what happens when your passions are rooted in ideologies and systems and not people. So remember, we live in a world of people. The rest of it is all make-believe. Learn to value what's important. God bless you guys all. Have a very good day. Tom Kaczynski out. And I'll see you on YouTube at 7:05 p.m. if you want to come on and say hello.